Have you ever found yourself wondering about the truly ancient mysteries of our world? Not the kind with hidden treasure maps or forgotten spells, but the deep, echoing enigmas of civilizations that rose and fell, leaving behind whispers of their existence. We're talking about questions that dig into the very soil of history. Where did certain peoples truly come from? How did their languages, their customs, their very identities manage to survive millennia of empires clashing and cultures blending? These aren't just dry historical facts. They're the fascinating, sometimes heartbreaking, stories of human endurance and the incredible resilience of a collective spirit. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop a comment below with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone is tuning in from. Our journey begins not with a bang, but with a very, very old whisper. A whisper that speaks of the Armenian people and their deep roots in a land known as the Armenian Highlands. This isn't just a geographical area on a map. It's a cradle of civilization, a rugged, mountainous terrain that has seen more history unfold than most libraries could ever contain. Imagine a vast plateau high above the surrounding plains, where towering peaks pierce the clouds and deep river valleys carve through ancient rock. This landscape, with its harsh winters and fertile, albeit often hard-won, agricultural pockets, wasn't just a backdrop. It was a character in the story, shaping the people who lived there. The very air, crisp and thin, seems to carry the echoes of countless generations, of peoples who scratched out a living from its soil, built their homes from its stone, and gazed up at the same star-strewn nights. Long before anything resembling Armenia appeared on Roman scrolls or Persian tablets, this region was home to complex societies, chief among them the kingdom of Urartu. Now, Urartu isn't exactly a household name, but it was a formidable power during the Iron Age, flourishing between the 9th and 6th centuries BCE. Imagine a sophisticated state, complete with impressive fortresses, intricate irrigation systems, and a distinctive cuneiform script. They worshipped a pantheon of gods, built cities with monumental stone walls, and perhaps, most importantly for our story, interacted constantly with their neighbors, including the Assyrians to the south, who were, shall we say, not known for their gentle disposition. Urartu's capital, Tushpa, near modern-day Van, was a marvel of its time, a testament to their advanced engineering and organizational skills. They were master metalworkers, creating exquisite bronze and iron artifacts, and their military was powerful enough to contend with the regional superpowers. Historians still argue whether the Urartians were direct ancestors of the Armenians or simply a significant cultural and political precursor. But what's clear is that the region they dominated, stretching around Lake Van, was precisely where the Armenian identity would later coalesce. While Urartu held sway, another entity, or perhaps a confederation of tribes, known as Hayasa-Azi, existed further west in the northern parts of the highlands. The connections between Hayasa-Azi and the eventual emergence of the Armenians are even more tantalizing and debated. Some ancient texts hint at a people called the Armens, or Armeni, who moved into the region, perhaps from the west, mixing with the indigenous populations already there. This is where history starts to feel a bit like a detective story, with fragments of evidence leading to multiple theories. Was it a gradual cultural assimilation or a more sudden migration that brought new elements into the existing tapestry of peoples? Whatever the exact mechanism, the blend of indigenous cultures, perhaps including remnants of Eurasian society, with these incoming groups, laid the foundation for something new, something distinct. It's like baking a cake where you have several delicious ingredients already in the bowl, and then a new, perhaps unexpected, one gets added, leading to a truly unique flavor profile. The result was a new synthesis, a distinct linguistic and cultural identity that would eventually coalesce into what we recognize as Armenian. The language itself offers fascinating clues. Classical Armenian, or Grabar, stands as an independent branch of the Indo-European family, bearing some unique characteristics that set it apart. It's not directly descended from Urartian, which was a Hurro-Urartian language, but it shows clear signs of long-term interaction and influence from the languages of the region. This linguistic evolution points to a complex process of cultural fusion rather than a simple replacement of one people by another. Think of it like a river that absorbs many tributaries, each adding its own distinct minerals and characteristics to the overall flow. The Armenian language, with its ancient roots and unique sounds, is a living testament to this millennia-long process of blending and adaptation. It's a bit like finding a perfectly preserved fossil that tells you a whole story about an ecosystem that existed millions of years ago. Only in this case, the fossil is still very much alive and spoken. These formative centuries, shrouded as they are in the mists of antiquity, were crucial. They established the deep connection between the Armenian people and their ancestral lands, a bond that would prove remarkably enduring through countless invasions, occupations, and upheavals. The rugged terrain, while offering some protection, also ensured a degree of isolation that allowed unique cultural traits to develop and persist. It fostered a resilience, a self-reliance, that would become a defining characteristic. This isn't to say life was easy, far from it. Survival in such an environment, often caught between competing powers, required toughness, adaptability, and an unwavering sense of identity. The very mountains became a symbol of their steadfastness, a silent witness to their struggles and triumphs. From these ancient roots, from the intermingling of ancient peoples in a distinctive geographical setting, the unique story of the Armenian nation slowly but surely began to unfurl. As the ancient echoes of Urartu and Hayasa Azi began to fade, a new chapter unfolded in the Armenian highlands, one deeply intertwined with the rise and fall of colossal empires. This wasn't a time of peaceful isolation. Quite the opposite. The region, positioned at the crossroads of continents, became a veritable highway for armies, traders, and cultural ideas, a kind of ancient superhighway where everyone, from ambitious kings to wandering philosophers, seemed to pass through. And let me tell you, when you're on a superhighway, you're either going to be absorbed into the flow or you're going to get run over. For the peoples of the Armenian highlands, it was often a mix of both. One of the first truly massive powers to cast its shadow over the region was the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Imagine an empire so vast it stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, a truly unprecedented global superpower for its time. When the Achaemenids, under Cyrus the Great, swept through the Near East in the 6th century BCE, they absorbed the remnants of Urartu and the various tribal groups in the highlands. But unlike some conquerors who simply obliterated what came before. The Achaemenids were pretty savvy administrators. They introduced a system of satraps, essentially provincial governors, who ruled on behalf of the great king. And guess what? One of these satrapies was called Armena. This is where the name Armenia really starts to solidify in the historical record. Under Achaemenid rule, Armenia was more than just a conquered territory. It was an important part of the empire, contributing soldiers, resources, and even some clever engineers to the Persian cause. The famous Behistun inscription, carved high on a cliff face in modern-day Iran, is a multilingual text that details the victories of Darius the Great. And there, etched into the stone for all time, alongside other significant regions, is Armenia. This isn't just a footnote. It's a testament to the region's established identity and strategic importance within one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. The satrapy of Armenia was responsible for paying tribute, often in horses, the Armenian highlands being famous for its equestrian traditions, and providing troops for the Persian army. This interaction wasn't just about subjugation. It also led to significant cultural exchange. Persian language and customs found their way into the Armenian lexicon and societal structure, influencing everything from administrative practices to architectural styles. It was a bit like living in a massive, ancient corporate conglomerate. You might be a subsidiary, but you're still part of the big machine, and you learn a thing or two from the head office. Now, while the Achaemenids brought a degree of stability and integration into a larger economic system, the Armenian people, or rather, the Proto-Armenian peoples, were still very much forging their distinct identity. This period saw the continuing development of the Armenian language and unique cultural practices. It's important to remember that these processes unfold over centuries, not overnight. It's like watching a mountain form, one tiny grain of sand at a time, until suddenly you have a massive, imposing peak. The Achaemenid period provided a crucial framework, a relatively stable environment for these internal developments to continue, even as they were part of a vast, multi-ethnic empire. The very notion of a unified Armenia within this administrative structure likely helped foster a nascent sense of collective identity among the disparate groups inhabiting the highlands. The influence wasn't just one way either. Armenian cavalry, renowned for their skill and bravery, became a valuable asset to the Persian military machine. Imagine being a Persian general trying to conquer some far-off land and having a contingent of these tough mountain-bred horsemen at your disposal. They were reliable, fierce, and knew how to handle difficult terrain. This mutual dependence, though unequal, forged connections and understanding between the ruling power and the local population. It also meant that Armenian leaders, often from established noble families, gained experience in military command and regional governance, skills that would prove vital when the imperial tide inevitably receded. Historians still argue whether the term Armenian at this stage referred to a single, cohesive ethnic group or a broader geographical and political designation for the people of Armenia. It's a bit like asking if American in the 17th century meant the same thing as it does today. The identity evolves. However, the consistent use of Armenia in Persian and later Greek records suggests a recognized, if perhaps not fully homogeneous, entity. This designation provided a focal point around which a more unified identity could eventually crystallize. The shared experience of being part of this immense empire, of contributing to its might, and of navigating its administrative structures served as a powerful unifying force. As the centuries of Achaemenid rule progressed, the Armenian highlands continued to be a vibrant mix of cultures and influences. Trade routes crisscrossed the land, bringing goods, ideas, and people from all corners of the empire. This constant influx prevented stagnation and fostered a dynamic cultural environment. The foundations were being laid, brick by brick, for the distinct civilization that would eventually emerge. It was a slow burn, not a sudden explosion, but each century added another layer to the complex tapestry that was becoming the Armenian identity. The administrative unity imposed by the Achaemenids, even if purely for imperial control, inadvertently cultivated a shared experience that would prove crucial in the long run. The vast Achaemenid Empire, for all its might and grandeur, wasn't eternal, and like all great powers, it eventually faced its own formidable challenge. This challenge arrived in the rather dashing form of Alexander the Great, who, with his Macedonian phalanx and insatiable ambition, swept across the known world in the late 4th century BCE. His conquests marked a seismic shift, ushering in the Hellenistic period, an era defined by the widespread dissemination of Greek culture, language, and ideas across the Near East. For the Armenian highlands, already a melting pot of ancient traditions, this meant another layer added to their rich cultural tapestry. It was like suddenly finding out that your local diner, which always served traditional comfort food, was now also offering gourmet fusion cuisine. A bit disorienting, but undeniably exciting. When Alexander's forces carved through the Achaemenid Empire, the satrapy of Armenia, like all other Persian provinces, eventually came under Macedonian control. However, Alexander's empire was, famously, short-lived. Upon his death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, began carving up his vast dominion among themselves. This chaotic period of succession wars, a sort of ancient Game of Thrones played out on a truly epic scale, directly impacted the future of Armenia. The highlands, being strategically vital and rich in resources, became a contested prize. Different Hellenistic kingdoms vied for influence, but ultimately, it was the Seleucid Empire, founded by Alexander's general Seleucus IV Nicator, that emerged as the dominant power in much of the former Achaemenid territories, including Armenia. Under Seleucid rule, the influence of Hellenistic culture deepened significantly. Greek became the language of administration, commerce, and intellectual life in many urban centers. New cities were founded or refounded along Greek lines, featuring gymnasiums, theaters, and agora, where philosophical debates might have taken place. Imagine toga-clad philosophers strolling through Armenian towns, discussing Plato and Aristotle. It might sound like a scene from a very strange historical comedy, but aspects of this cultural exchange were quite real. While the rural areas likely retained much of their indigenous character, the elites and urban populations were increasingly exposed to, and in some cases, embraced Greek customs and artistic styles. This wasn't just superficial. It was a profound interaction that left its mark on everything from coinage to temple architecture. However, the Seleucid grip on their vast empire wasn't always firm, especially in its more distant provinces. As the Seleucid Empire began to weaken, plagued by internal strife and external pressures, local dynasties seized opportunities to assert their independence. And this is precisely where the Artaxiad dynasty comes into our story, marking a pivotal moment in the formation of a truly independent Armenian state. The name Artaxiad itself comes from Artaxias Thban, who seized power around 189 BCE. He had served as a strategist under the Seleucid king Antiochus III the Great. But when Antiochus was defeated by the Romans at the Battle of Magnesia, Artaxias saw his chance. It's a classic case of when the cat's away, the mice will play. Except these mice were ambitious and highly capable regional governors. Artaxias, I wasn't just a rebel, he was a nation builder. He actively worked to consolidate Armenian lands, uniting various principalities and tribes under his rule. He understood the strategic importance of borders and actively defined and defended them, often using natural features like rivers as boundaries. He also founded a new capital city, Artashat, strategically located on the Arax River. Plutarch, the Greek biographer, even suggests that Hannibal Barca, the famous Carthaginian general who was then living in exile and serving as an advisor to Artaxias, had a hand in the planning of Artashat. Whether that's true or merely a delightful historical anecdote, it certainly adds a touch of legendary flair to the city's origins. Artashat became a flourishing cultural and economic hub, a clear symbol of the nascent Armenian kingdom's independence and growing power. The rise of the Artaxiads demonstrated a growing sense of distinct Armenian identity, one that could assert itself against larger Hellenistic powers. While they adopted many Hellenistic elements, especially in art and administration, they did so on their own terms, integrating them into an existing Armenian cultural framework. They understood the value of a strong central authority and a unified territory, learning lessons from both the Achaemenids and the Seleucids. This period truly laid the groundwork for the most glorious chapter of ancient Armenian history, setting the stage for the emergence of a truly formidable regional power. It was like a young sapling finally breaking through the undergrowth, ready to grow into a magnificent tree. From the sturdy foundations laid by Artaxias the Firm, the Armenian kingdom was poised for its moment in the sun, and that sun truly blazed forth during the reign of Tigranes II, universally known as Tigranes the Great. Imagine a king who wasn't just content with ruling his own corner of the world, but dreamed of an empire that stretched from sea to shining sea. This wasn't just a lofty ambition. Tigranes made it a reality, transforming Armenia from a regional power into one of the most significant empires of the Hellenistic East. His reign from approximately 95 to 55 BCE represents the absolute zenith of ancient Armenian power and influence, a period of grandeur that would be recalled with wistful pride for centuries to come. Tigranes inherited a strong unified kingdom from his predecessors, but he had a vision that far surpassed theirs. His early reign was marked by strategic alliances and calculated military campaigns. He formed a crucial alliance with Mithridates VI of Pontus, another ambitious monarch who was a thorn in the side of the burgeoning Roman Republic. This alliance, cemented by Tigranes' marriage to Mithridates' daughter Cleopatra, provided him with a powerful ally and access to experienced military commanders and resources. With this security on his western flank, Tigranes turned his gaze eastward and southward, where the Seleucid Empire, once mighty, was now a shadow of its former self. riddled with internal conflicts and squabbling claimants to the throne. It was like finding a rival company suddenly going bankrupt, leaving a huge market open for the taking. Tigranes capitalized on this weakness with ruthless efficiency. He expanded his dominion rapidly, conquering parts of Mesopotamia, Syria, Cilicia, and even reaching as far south as Judea. At its peak, his empire stretched from the Black Sea in the north to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and across much of Mesopotamia to the east. He essentially carved out a massive chunk of what was once the Seleucid realm, effectively becoming the new hegemon of the Near East. This wasn't just about territorial acquisition. It was about asserting a new geopolitical order. The sheer scale of his conquests was staggering, encompassing diverse peoples and cultures under Armenian rule. He even moved populations, resettling them to strengthen his control and manpower. To govern this sprawling empire, Tigranes founded a magnificent new capital, Tigranokerta. The exact location of Tigranokerta is a subject of ongoing archaeological and scholarly debate, but it was undoubtedly conceived as a grand multicultural metropolis, a jewel in the crown of his vast domain. He forcibly relocated inhabitants from conquered cities, including many Greeks, to populate his new capital, transforming it into a vibrant center of commerce, administration, and culture. The city was said to be adorned with lavish palaces, extensive gardens, and a theater, showcasing Tigranes' adoption and adaptation of Hellenistic urban planning and aesthetics. It was a conscious statement of power and prestige, a direct challenge to the old Hellenistic centers. The sheer audacity of Tigranes' expansion naturally caught the attention of the great emerging power of the West, the Roman Republic. Initially, Rome was preoccupied with its wars against Mithridates VI, but as Tigranes' empire grew, he inevitably clashed with Roman interests. The stage was set for an epic confrontation between the established might of Rome and the rising power of Armenia. The Roman general Lucullus was dispatched to deal with Mithridates and eventually turned his attention to Tigranes, demanding the surrender of Mithridates and a rollback of Armenian conquests. Tigranes, confident in his vast armies and impregnable new capital, initially refused. This led to the Battle of Tigranokerta in 69 BC. Despite having a numerically superior army, Tigranes suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of Lucullus. The Roman legions, disciplined and tactically superior, proved too much for the diverse forces of the Armenian Empire. The fall of Tigranokerta was a significant blow, both militarily and psychologically. It revealed the limits of Tigranes' power and the formidable might of Rome. Following this defeat, Tigranes faced further challenges, including internal dissent and continued Roman pressure, this time from Pompey the Great, who eventually replaced Lucullus. Pompey adopted a more pragmatic approach, recognizing that a stable Armenia could serve as a valuable buffer state against the Parthian Empire, Rome's emerging rival in the east. In 66 BCE, Tigranes formally submitted to Pompey. He was allowed to retain his Armenian homeland and some territories, but his grand empire was largely dismantled. While a clear setback, this settlement demonstrated Rome's recognition of Armenia's strategic importance and Tigranes' continued authority within his reduced kingdom. He died a few years later, having reigned for nearly 4 decades. Tigranes the Great's legacy is complex, a brilliant military strategist and empire builder who dramatically elevated Armenia's standing but who ultimately underestimated the rising tide of Roman power. Yet his reign instilled in the Armenian people a powerful memory of past glory, a golden age of imperial reach that would forever remain a source of national pride. Historians still argue whether Tigranes' rapid expansion was a brilliant but ultimately unsustainable gamble against the established powers, or a necessary consolidation of regional power in a volatile geopolitical landscape. Regardless, his name became synonymous with Armenian strength and ambition, a benchmark against which future rulers would be measured. With the passing of Tigranes the Great, the era of vast Armenian imperial expansion drew to a close, and a new, more precarious reality set in. The Armenian Kingdom, now shorn of its grand conquests, found itself trapped in an unenviable position, a crucial buffer state caught squarely between two titanic empires. The ever-expanding Roman Republic, soon to be empire, in the west, and the formidable Parthian Empire in the east. Imagine being a small but important piece of furniture in a very large, very active wrestling match. You're constantly being pushed, pulled, and occasionally sat upon by two enormous, aggressive contenders. It was a geopolitical nightmare, yet also a testament to Armenia's strategic value. For centuries, Armenia became the unwilling stage for proxy wars and direct confrontations between Rome and Parthia. Both empires recognized the strategic importance of controlling the Armenian highlands. For Rome, it was a gateway to Mesopotamia and a potential bulwark against Parthian incursions into their Anatolian provinces. For Parthia, Armenia offered access to the Black Sea and a critical buffer zone protecting their own heartland. Neither side wanted the other to fully control it, leading to a relentless cycle of invasions, puppet kings, and shifting allegiances. It was a dizzying dance of diplomacy and destruction, often decided by the latest military campaign. The Roman approach to Armenia was often characterized by attempts to install pro-Roman rulers, while the Parthians naturally preferred pro-Parthian candidates. This often led to two rival kings simultaneously claiming the Armenian throne, each backed by one of the superpowers. One moment, an Armenian king might be crowned by a Roman general, only to be overthrown by a Parthian invasion the next, his successor placed on the throne with a Parthian diadem. This instability was a constant drain on the kingdom, preventing long-term development and fostering a sense of perpetual insecurity. The Armenian people, caught in the middle, simply had to learn to adapt, to bend with the wind rather than break. It was a masterclass in political survival, albeit a very stressful one. Perhaps the most enduring outcome of this Roman-Parthian rivalry was the establishment of the Arsacid dynasty of Armenia. This dynasty was a branch of the Parthian Arsacids, initially installed by the Parthian Empire to secure their influence over Armenia. However, over time, these Armenian Arsacids, despite their Parthian origins, gradually became thoroughly harmonized. They adopted Armenian customs, embraced the local culture, and increasingly identified with their Armenian subjects, rather than their distant Parthian relatives. This transformation was crucial. It meant that even when a king was placed on the throne by a foreign power, he often developed a strong loyalty to his new kingdom. This was a unique blend of foreign lineage and local identity, creating a dynasty that would rule Armenia for several centuries, providing a degree of internal stability amidst external pressures. One of the most notable periods of this tug-of-war involved the Roman Emperor Nero and the Parthian king Vologases Pons. The issue of who controlled Armenia became a major point of contention. After a series of campaigns, battles, and diplomatic maneuvers, a compromise was finally reached around 63 CE. According to the Treaty of Rhandaea, a Parthian Arsacid prince named Tiridates would be recognized as the king of Armenia, but he would receive his crown from the Roman emperor in Rome. This was a brilliant diplomatic solution. Rome maintained the prestige of granting the crown, while Parthia secured an Arsacid on the Armenian throne. It was a face-saving victory for both sides, a moment where diplomacy, for once, trumped outright warfare. Tiridates even made the long journey to Rome, where he was formally crowned by Nero in a lavish ceremony. A truly spectacular display of imperial power, and a memorable moment in ancient diplomacy. This established a precedent for Armenian kings to be of Arsacid Parthian lineage, but required Roman approval, a delicate balance that endured for some time. Despite the constant external interference, the Armenian Arsacid kings managed to foster periods of relative peace and cultural development. They navigated the treacherous geopolitical waters with remarkable skill, often playing Rome and Parthia against each other to maintain their autonomy. This required shrewd diplomacy, military readiness, and a deep understanding of the two empires' shifting priorities. While their territory might shrink or expand depending on the latest imperial whim, the core of the Armenian kingdom, under its Arsacid rulers, persisted. They built cities, supported art and literature, and slowly but surely continued to solidify a distinct Armenian identity. The Roman-Parthian rivalry also brought Armenia into closer contact with Western Roman culture, even as it retained its strong Eastern influences. Roman architectural styles, legal concepts, and military organization subtly seeped into Armenian society. Conversely, Armenian culture, with its ancient traditions and unique characteristics, also left its mark on the broader Roman East. It was a constant cultural exchange, a vibrant blend of influences that made the Armenian highlands a truly unique corner of the ancient world. This era of being a buffer state, while fraught with danger, undeniably forged the resilience and distinct identity that would define the Armenian people for millennia. It taught them the art of survival under immense pressure, a skill that would prove indispensable in the centuries to come. As the Roman and Parthian empires continued their grand, often violent, geopolitical chess match over the Armenian highlands, something truly transformative was brewing within Armenia itself, an event so profound that it would forever alter the trajectory of the Armenian people and define their very essence. This wasn't a conquest or a new dynasty or even a shifting border. It was the adoption of Christianity as the state religion. Imagine a nation surrounded by powerful pagan empires making such a bold and singular declaration. It wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a political, cultural, and national rebirth, marking Armenia as distinct from its neighbors and aligning its destiny with a new, rapidly spreading faith. It's like a band suddenly deciding to switch genres entirely, from rock to classical. It fundamentally changes their identity and how they present themselves to the world. The traditional date for this momentous event is 301 CE, making Armenia arguably the first nation in the world to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion. Now, Some historians debate the exact year, pushing it a few decades later. But the core fact remains. Armenia embraced Christianity as a national faith before even the Roman Empire, which would only do so later with Emperor Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan. This timing is incredibly significant, placing Armenia at the forefront of a global religious movement. It wasn't just a handful of individuals converting. It was a top-down, royal decree that fundamentally reshaped society. The central figure in this narrative is St. Gregory the Illuminator. Before his work, King Tiridates III, also known as Tradathro, was a staunch pagan and, according to legend, actively persecuted Christians in his kingdom. The story goes that Gregory, born to a noble family, was himself imprisoned for 13 years in a deep pit, or Korverap, for his Christian faith. It's quite the dramatic origin story for a national saint, isn't it? Imagine being stuck down a hole for over a decade, only to emerge and convince the king who put you there to convert. Talk about a glow-up. The legend further recounts that King Tiridates III fell ill, perhaps even transforming into a boar in a fit of divine madness, and only Gregory, miraculously released from his dungeon, was able to cure him. This miraculous healing supposedly led to the king's conversion. Whether the details are literal or embellished, the historical fact remains that King Tiridates III, recognizing the moral and unifying potential of the new faith, made the monumental decision to declare Christianity the official religion of Armenia. This was a radical departure from the polytheistic traditions that had dominated the region for millennia, with their temples to gods like Aramazd, Anahit, and Vahan. The adoption of Christianity wasn't just a spiritual shift. It was a deliberate act of nation-building. It provided a unified moral code, a common identity that transcended tribal loyalties, and a sense of shared purpose for the Armenian people. In a region constantly under external pressure, a shared religion became a powerful internal glue. The immediate aftermath of this conversion was a period of intense religious and cultural transformation. Old pagan temples were either destroyed or consecrated as churches. A new ecclesiastical hierarchy was established, with St. Gregory becoming the first Catholicos, the head of the Armenian Church. This early Armenian Church developed its own distinct rites and theological interpretations, separate from both the Byzantine and Latin churches that would later dominate the Christian world. This independent development further solidified Armenia's unique identity. It wasn't just Christian, it was Armenian Christian. One of the most profound consequences of this adoption was the eventual creation of the Armenian alphabet by Mesrop Mashtots in the early 5th century CE. While this happened a century after the initial conversion, it was a direct result of the need to translate the Bible and other Christian texts into the Armenian language. Before Mashtots, Armenian was primarily an oral language, or written using Greek, Syriac, or Persian scripts, none of which perfectly captured its unique sounds. Imagine trying to write English using only the Greek alphabet. It would be a messy affair. The invention of a distinct Armenian script was an act of profound cultural preservation and empowerment. It enabled the widespread literacy of religious texts, but more importantly, it allowed for the flourishing of a unique Armenian literature, cementing the language and solidifying the national identity. This was not just a tool for evangelism, it was a tool for survival. a way to ensure that Armenian thought and culture could be recorded and transmitted across generations, even in the absence of political independence. It's almost as if they said, "You can take our land, but you can't take our letters." The adoption of Christianity also had significant geopolitical ramifications. It further distinguished Armenia from its Zoroastrian Persian neighbors to the east, and sometimes brought it into conflict with the pagan Roman Empire before its own conversion. Later, it would align Armenia, spiritually if not always politically, with the Christian Byzantine Empire. This religious alignment, however, did not guarantee perpetual peace or protection. Indeed, adherence to a distinct form of Christianity would often become a point of contention and a pretext for persecution by non-Christian overlords in the centuries to come. But despite the hardships it would sometimes invite, the decision to embrace Christianity proved to be a bedrock of Armenian identity, a source of resilience and unity that has endured to the present day. Historians still argue whether the conversion was a purely spiritual awakening or a shrewd political calculation to unify the populace and distinguish Armenia from its powerful, often hostile, neighbors. Whatever the primary motivation, its impact was undeniably monumental. Having embraced Christianity as its national faith, Armenia found itself navigating a complex and often perilous geopolitical landscape, especially with its powerful eastern neighbor, the Sasanian Persian Empire. Unlike the Romans, who would eventually adopt Christianity, the Sasanians were ardent adherents of Zoroastrianism, a monotheistic ancient Persian religion that held fire and purity as central tenets. For the Sasanians, the spread of Christianity in Armenia was not just a religious anomaly, but a grave political threat. It was seen as a potential fifth column, an ideological alignment with their perennial rivals, the Romans, and later, the Byzantines. Imagine two empires, each viewing the other's state religion as not just wrong, but actively subversive. This dynamic set the stage for centuries of religious and cultural clashes, often erupting into brutal warfare. The Sasanians pursued a policy of religious uniformity, believing that a strong empire required a single state-sanctioned religion. They viewed Armenian Christianity as an insidious foreign influence that needed to be eradicated or, at the very least, brought under strict Sasanian control. Their attempts to forcibly convert the Armenians to Zoroastrianism became a recurring theme, leading to periods of intense persecution and fierce resistance. This wasn't just about theological debates. It was about national identity, political loyalty, and the very soul of the Armenian people. It's like being told you have to switch your favorite sports team, not just for a season, but forever. And if you don't, there will be serious consequences. One of the most iconic and pivotal moments in this struggle was the Battle of Avarer in 451 CE. The Sasanian king Yazdegerd II, frustrated by Armenian recalcitrance, issued an edict demanding their conversion to Zoroastrianism. The Armenians, led by the military commander Vadan Mamikonian, openly defied this order. They knew they were massively outnumbered and outmatched by the Sasanian imperial army, which included war elephants, the ancient equivalent of tanks. Yet they chose to fight. The battle itself, fought on the plain of Avarer, was a devastating defeat for the Armenians. Vadan Mamikonian and many of his noble companions perished, martyred for their faith. On the surface, It was a crushing military loss. However, the Battle of Avarir, despite being a tactical defeat, proved to be a profound moral and spiritual victory for the Armenians. The sheer ferocity of their resistance, their willingness to die for their Christian faith, left an undeniable impression on the Sasanians. It demonstrated that force alone would not extinguish Armenian Christianity. The Sasanians realized that constant, brutal suppression would only foster perpetual rebellion, making Armenia an ungovernable and costly province. It was a classic win the battle, lose the war scenario for the Persians. The battle thus became a symbol of Armenian defiance and martyrdom, deeply embedded in their national consciousness. To this day, Vardan Mamikonian is revered as a national hero and a saint in the Armenian Church. Following Avarir, Sasanian policy towards Armenia gradually shifted. While they continued to exert political control, the attempts at forced conversion became less overt and more nuanced. This eventually led to the Treaty of Nvasak in 484 CE. This landmark treaty, negotiated between the Armenians Parapet, commander-in-chief, Vahan Mamikonian, Vardan's nephew, and the Sasanian king Perosthesm, granted significant religious freedom to the Armenians. It recognized their right to practice Christianity freely and guaranteed the autonomy of the Armenian Church. This was a monumental achievement, securing the very identity of the Armenian nation in the face of overwhelming power. It meant that while Armenia remained politically subservient to the Sasanians, its spiritual and cultural core was preserved. The Sasanian period also saw significant developments in Armenian culture, often paradoxically spurred by the very pressures they faced. The 5th century, following the invention of the Armenian alphabet, is often referred to as the Golden Age of Armenian literature. Scholars translated numerous Greek and Syriac Christian texts into Armenian, creating a rich theological and philosophical tradition. This was not merely translation. It involved adapting and interpreting these texts, enriching the Armenian language and shaping its intellectual landscape. Monasteries became centers of learning and preservation, safeguarding Armenian identity and knowledge. Imagine monks diligently copying manuscripts by candlelight, ensuring that the wisdom of generations would not be lost. This era solidified the unique character of Armenian Christianity, distinct in its liturgy, theology, and ecclesiastical structure from both Constantinople and Rome. Despite the periods of relative peace, Armenia remained a contested zone, often divided into spheres of influence between the Sasanians and the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire. The eastern parts of historical Armenia largely remained under Sasanian sway, while the western parts often fell under Byzantine control. This division meant that Armenians sometimes fought on opposing sides in the great wars between the two empires. Yet, through all these shifts in overlordship and the constant threat to their religious identity, the Armenian people, fortified by their faith and their unique cultural institutions, managed to endure. They learned that their true strength lay not just in military might, but in the unwavering adherence to their Christian faith and the flourishing of their distinct language and culture. This period cemented Christianity not just as a religion, but as an indispensable component of Armenian nationhood. Just as the Armenian people had found a way to maintain their Christian identity under the Zoroastrian Sasanians, a new and even more profound shift was about to sweep across the Near East. The rapid expansion of Islam. From the Arabian Peninsula, a new faith and a new power emerged in the 7th century, driven by zealous conviction and military prowess. The Arab conquests were swift and decisive, fundamentally altering the geopolitical and cultural landscape from Spain to Persia. For Armenia, situated squarely in the path of this expansion, it meant yet another change of overlords, bringing with it new challenges, new opportunities, and a long period of adaptation under Islamic rule. It's like being a small village that has seen several different empires come and go, each leaving its mark. But this time, the new arrival is not just bringing a different flag, but a completely different way of seeing the world. The Byzantine and Sasanian empires, exhausted by centuries of intermittent warfare against each other, were ill-prepared for the unified and highly motivated Arab armies. Both empires suffered catastrophic defeats, and their vast territories quickly fell. Armenia, as a frontier province for both, found itself caught in the middle of this new wave. The first major Arab incursions into Armenia began in the mid-7th century. Initially, these were raids, but soon they turned into full-scale invasions, aiming for permanent conquest. The Armenians, still reeling from the Sasanian wars and internal divisions, offered resistance, but it was largely fragmented and ultimately unsuccessful against the overwhelming force of the Arab Caliphate. By the late 7th century, most of Armenia had fallen under the control of the Umayyad Caliphate, and later the Abbasid Caliphate. Armenia became an autonomous province within the vast Islamic Empire, often referred to as the Ostikanate of Armenia. The Arabs appointed governors, known as Ostikans, to administer the region. This new political reality brought about significant changes. The primary language of administration shifted to Arabic, and Arab garrisons were stationed in key cities. Islamic law and taxation systems were introduced, most notably the jizya, a poll tax levied on non-Muslims, and the kharaj, a land tax. While burdensome, these taxes generally allowed Christians and Jews to practice their religions, albeit as dhimmis or protected peoples, under certain limitations. Despite being under Islamic rule, the Armenian people largely maintained their Christian faith. The Armenian Church, with its deep roots and unique independent structure, proved incredibly resilient. Monasteries and churches continued to function, serving as vital centers for cultural and religious preservation. While there were periods of harsher persecution, particularly under certain caliphs who sought more aggressive Islamization, the general policy allowed for the survival of the Christian community. This was largely due to the sheer numerical strength of the Armenian Christians and their steadfast adherence to their faith. Imagine trying to change the mind of an entire nation. It's a pretty tough sell, especially when their faith is intertwined with their national identity. However, resistance to Arab rule was a recurring theme. Armenian noble families, like the Bagratuni and the Atsruni, often led revolts, sometimes seizing periods of weakness in the caliphate to assert temporary independence. These uprisings, though often crushed, demonstrated a persistent desire for self-rule and a refusal to be fully assimilated. These were often localized struggles, but they kept the flame of Armenian sovereignty flickering. The caliphate, recognizing the difficulty of fully subjugating the mountainous and fiercely independent Armenians, often preferred to maintain a degree of indirect rule, relying on Armenian princes to govern locally in exchange for tribute and loyalty. This created a complex relationship marked by both submission and subtle defiance. The Arab period also saw the development of more complex trade routes that integrated Armenia into the broader Islamic world. Cities like Tvin, which served as the Ostikhan's capital, flourished as commercial centers, attracting merchants from across the caliphate. This economic integration brought new architectural styles, scientific knowledge, and agricultural techniques into Armenia. While politically subservient, there was a dynamic cultural exchange. Arabic scholarship and scientific advancements certainly found their way into Armenian intellectual circles, just as Armenian ingenuity contributed to the wider Islamic world. One significant challenge during this period was demographic change. While Armenians remained the majority in many areas, particularly the highlands, there was an influx of Arab settlers, particularly into urban centers and fertile plains. Over time, some Armenians, especially those seeking greater economic or political opportunities, did convert to Islam, though this was generally a slow process and not on a scale that fundamentally altered the Christian character of the core Armenian lands. Historians still argue whether the long period of Arab rule was primarily a period of repression or one of cautious coexistence and cultural exchange. It was likely both, depending on the specific time and region. What is clear is that despite external domination, the Armenian people, fortified by their resilient church and sense of shared heritage, endured. The Arab conquests did not extinguish the Armenian spirit. Rather, they forced it to adapt, to become even more ingrained in its unique Christian identity as a means of survival. This resilience would lay the groundwork for a remarkable resurgence of Armenian power when the caliphate itself began to fragment. As the vast, sprawling Islamic caliphate, once an unstoppable force, began to show cracks in its immense edifice, a familiar pattern re-emerged in the Armenian highlands. Local autonomy reasserting itself amidst imperial decline. This fragmentation of central power, particularly of the Abbasid Caliphate, created the perfect conditions for the rise of a new, powerful Armenian dynasty, the Bagratunis Kingdom. This wasn't just another princely state. It was a genuine rebirth of Armenian independence, a period often remembered as a golden age where Armenian culture, architecture, and political influence flourished once more. It's like a grand old tree that seemed to be withering under a long drought, suddenly finding new life and bursting forth with vibrant leaves. The Bagratuni family was not new to the scene. They were an ancient and highly influential Armenian noble family with deep roots in the region, tracing their lineage back through centuries. They had served as hereditary nakarars, or princes, under both Byzantine and Arab rule, often playing a delicate balancing act between submission and subtle defiance. As Abbasid power waned in the 9th century, particularly with the rise of semi-independent emirates and local governors, the Bagratunis skillfully leveraged their wealth, military strength, and diplomatic acumen to consolidate their power. They managed to gain recognition from both the weakening caliphate and the Byzantine Empire, often playing one against the other to secure their own position. It was a masterclass in geopolitical opportunism. The pivotal moment came in 884 CE, when Ashot Bagratuni was officially recognized as King of Armenia by both the Abbasid Caliph and the Byzantine Emperor. This dual recognition was crucial lending legitimacy to his rule and signaling a rare consensus from the two dominant powers of the region. Ashutai was not merely a tribal chief. He was a unifying figure who brought together various Armenian principalities under his banner. This marked the official restoration of an independent Armenian monarchy, the first in over 4 centuries. Imagine the collective sigh of relief and pride that must have swept across the Armenian highlands as they once again had their own king. The Bagratuni Kingdom, centered initially around the city of Bagaran and later the magnificent city of Ani, grew into a formidable regional power. Ani, often referred to as the city of 1001 churches, became the dazzling capital, a testament to the kingdom's prosperity and cultural vibrancy. Its towering walls, intricate churches, and bustling markets were renowned throughout the East. Under the Bagratuni kings, Armenia experienced a significant cultural and economic revival. Trade flourished along the east-west routes that crisscrossed the kingdom, bringing wealth and new ideas. Agriculture thrived, and Armenian artisans produced exquisite crafts, textiles, and metalwork. The Bagratuni period was also a time of significant architectural innovation, particularly in church construction. The unique Armenian ecclesiastical architecture, characterized by its distinctive dome structures and intricate stone carvings, reached new heights. Many of the stunning churches and cathedrals that dot the Armenian landscape today, or whose ruins stand as haunting reminders of past glory, were built during this era. This wasn't just about constructing buildings. It was an expression of national pride and religious devotion, a physical manifestation of their renewed independence and cultural self-confidence. They were literally building their identity in stone. Politically, the Bagratuni Kingdom was not a monolithic empire like Tigranes the Great's, but rather a confederation of semi-autonomous principalities under the suzerainty of the Bagratuni king. While this federal structure sometimes led to internal squabbles and rivalries among noble families, it also allowed for a degree of local governance and resilience. The king, however, was ultimately responsible for defending the realm against external threats, primarily from various Muslim emirates on their borders, and increasingly from the Byzantine Empire to the west. One of the more enduring internal challenges for the Bagratuni kings was managing the powerful Armenian nobility, the Nakharars, who guarded their traditional rights and lands fiercely. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring both strength and diplomacy to keep the kingdom unified. Imagine herding cats, but the cats are heavily armed feudal lords with ancestral claims. Sometimes, a king would exert strong central control, while at other times, the centrifugal forces of the nobility would lead to fragmentation. Historians still argue about the precise balance of power within the Bagratuni kingdom. Was it a truly centralized state, or more of a loose confederation? Despite these internal dynamics, the Bagratuni kingdom enjoyed a remarkable period of independence and prosperity that lasted for roughly 2 centuries. It allowed for the further development of a distinct Armenian identity rooted in their Christian faith, unique language, and rich cultural traditions. The memory of this golden age, with its magnificent capital of Ani, would serve as a powerful beacon for Armenians in subsequent centuries of foreign domination, a reminder of what they had achieved when masters of their own destiny. It was a golden age that, while not lasting forever, imprinted an indelible mark on the Armenian collective memory, a high point to aspire to in times of adversity. Even as the Bagratuni kingdom reached its cultural and architectural zenith, casting the magnificent shadow of Ani across the Armenian highlands, new clouds began to gather on its western horizon. This time, the looming power wasn't a distant caliphate or a new nomadic horde, but the very empire that shared Armenia's Christian faith, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, with its capital in Constantinople, was a formidable force, steeped in centuries of imperial tradition and driven by a desire to restore the glory of ancient Rome. For Armenia, this meant a shift from battling Islamic pressure to contending with the ambitions of a fellow Christian superpower, a situation that often proved just as, if not more, complex and ultimately detrimental. It's like finally finding a good, stable neighbor after years of chaotic ones, only to discover that they really want to help you by moving into your house. The Byzantines, particularly under their more ambitious emperors of the 10th and 11th centuries, pursued a policy of aggressive expansion and centralization. They viewed the independent Armenian kingdom, with its distinct church and powerful Bagratuni rulers, as a potential threat to their eastern flank, or at best, an area ripe for absorption into their vast imperial structure. Their strategic goals were clear: secure their borders, integrate buffer states, and bring all Christian communities under the direct ecclesiastical authority of the Patriarch of Constantinople. This desire for religious conformity was a significant point of friction, as the Armenian Apostolic Church, having developed independently, had its own unique theological interpretations and a strong tradition of autonomy. The Byzantine approach wasn't always outright military conquest. It often involved a shrewd mix of diplomacy, intrigue, and gradual encroachment. They would exploit internal divisions among the Armenian nobility, offering titles and lands to princes willing to shift their allegiance to Constantinople. They would also annex smaller Armenian principalities one by one, gradually eroding the Bagratuni kingdom's territorial integrity and political influence. Imagine a patient, powerful boa constrictor slowly but surely squeezing its prey. That was often the Byzantine strategy. Emperors like Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer for his ruthless campaigns in the Balkans, also set their sights on the Caucasus. The fragmentation of the Bagratuni kingdom, despite its initial successes, played directly into Byzantine hands. The rivalries among various Bagratuni branches and other Armenian noble families meant that they rarely presented a united front against the encroaching Byzantines. When one principality fell, others often failed to come to its aid, focused instead on their own immediate interests or historical grievances. This internal disunity, a recurring theme in Armenian history, proved to be their Achilles' heel. It allowed the Byzantines to pick them off piecemeal, rather than facing a cohesive, unified Armenian resistance. A key turning point came in 1045, when the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Monomachos formally annexed the city of Ani, the magnificent Bagratuni capital. This wasn't achieved through a grand battle, but largely through political maneuvering and the betrayal of certain Armenian nobles, coupled with the abdication of the last Bagratuni king, Gagik II, under immense Byzantine pressure. The fall of Ani was a symbolic and practical disaster. It marked the end of the independent Bagratuni Kingdom in Armenia and signaled the complete absorption of the Armenian heartland into the Byzantine Empire. The once proud city of 1,001 churches, a beacon of Armenian culture, became just another imperial outpost. The consequences of Byzantine annexation were profound. While it brought Armenia into the administrative framework of a powerful Christian empire, it also had significant drawbacks. The Byzantines often pursued policies of Hellenization, attempting to integrate Armenian institutions and clergy into the Byzantine system. This included attempts to force the Armenian Church to conform to Chalcedonian orthodoxy, which was at odds with the Armenian Apostolic Church's Miaphysite theology. These religious differences, dating back to the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, had long been a point of contention and now became a tool for imperial control. Furthermore, the Byzantine administration often removed Armenian nobles from their traditional lands, replacing them with Byzantine governors, or moving Armenian populations to other parts of the empire, particularly to Anatolia, as a means of population control and border defense. This involuntary migration, while sometimes framed as strategic resettlement, led to significant demographic shifts and the weakening of traditional Armenian social structures in their homeland. Many Armenians, including members of the nobility, found themselves transplanted to new regions, often to serve as frontier guards for the Byzantine Empire. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine annexation of Armenia was a net positive or negative for the Armenian people. Some argue it provided a period of relative peace and stability under a powerful Christian empire, while others contend it weakened Armenian national identity and paved the way for subsequent, more devastating invasions. What is clear is that the absorption of the Armenian kingdom into the Byzantine Empire, driven by imperial ambition and religious differences, left the Armenian heartland vulnerable. It effectively removed the independent Armenian buffer state precisely when a new, far more destructive force was gathering momentum in the east, the Seljuk Turks. The very act of seemingly strengthening their eastern frontier would, ironically, weaken it further. No sooner had the Byzantine Empire consolidated its control over the Armenian highlands, believing it had secured its eastern flank, than a new, incredibly disruptive force emerged from the vast Central Asian steppes, the Seljuk Turks. These nomadic, Turkic warriors, having converted to Sunni Islam, were driven by a powerful migratory impulse and a fierce military prowess. Their arrival marked a turning point for the entire Near East, and for Armenia, it heralded a period of immense upheaval, destruction, and profound demographic change. It was like finally settling into a new, albeit slightly uncomfortable home after years of moving, only for a literal whirlwind to descend and tear everything apart. The Seljuk invasions began in the mid-11th century, initially as raids, but quickly escalating into full-scale conquests. Unlike the more structured imperial administrations of the Persians, Romans, or Arabs, the Seljuk advance was often characterized by a decentralized, tribal approach, initially focused on plunder and pasture lands rather than systematic governance. This made them incredibly unpredictable and devastating. The Armenian lands, having just been fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire, were now directly in the path of these westward-moving hordes. The Byzantines, despite their large armies, were often unprepared for the Seljuks' lightning-fast cavalry tactics and their sheer numbers. A pivotal moment that perfectly illustrates the impact of the Seljuk invasions was the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 C. This wasn't just a battle over Armenia. It was a watershed moment for the entire Byzantine Empire, and by extension, the future of Anatolia and Armenia. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a massive army, including Armenian and other allied contingents, to confront the Seljuk forces led by Alp-Arslan. Despite its size, the Byzantine army suffered a catastrophic defeat. Emperor Romanos himself was captured, a humiliation almost unthinkable for a Roman emperor. The Battle of Manzikert effectively shattered Byzantine control over eastern Anatolia and critically over the Armenian highlands. The immediate aftermath of Manzikert was chaos. With Byzantine authority crumbling, the Seljuk Turks were free to pour into Anatolia and Armenia. Cities that had flourished under Bagratuni or Byzantine rule were besieged, sacked, and often left in ruins. The magnificent city of Ani, only recently annexed by the Byzantines, suffered terribly under Seljuk attacks, its once proud structures eventually falling into decay. The indigenous Armenian population faced immense hardship, including widespread massacres, enslavement, and forced displacement. Entire regions that had been predominantly Armenian for millennia began to see significant Turkic settlement. The nature of Seljuk rule varied. While some areas might experience direct military occupation, others fell under the sway of various Turkic chieftains or emirates who carved out their own semi-independent domains. This decentralized power structure meant that there was no single, consistent policy towards the Armenians. In some instances, Armenians were able to coexist with their new rulers, maintaining their churches and communities under the dhimmi system, similar to earlier Arab rule. In others, particularly in areas heavily contested or subjected to zealous leaders, persecution and forced conversions were more common. The Seljuk invasions had a profound and lasting demographic impact on the Armenian highlands. Large numbers of Armenians were either killed, enslaved, or migrated westward and southward, fleeing the destruction. This westward migration was particularly significant, as it led to the strengthening of Armenian communities in Cilicia, modern-day southern Turkey, which would soon become the locus of a new, independent Armenian kingdom. The demographic shift meant that the historical Armenian homeland, while still retaining a substantial Armenian population, began to see a growing Turkic presence, fundamentally altering the ethnic and religious makeup of the region. Culturally, the Seljuk period was challenging for the Armenians. The destruction of monasteries and churches and the general instability naturally hindered artistic and literary production in the immediate aftermath of the invasions. However, the resilient Armenian Church continued to be a crucial anchor for the community, providing spiritual guidance and a sense of continuity amidst the upheaval. Armenian intellectual life and cultural production found new homes in diaspora communities and in more secure regions like Cilicia. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of the Battle of Manzikert. Was it the sole cause of Byzantine decline and the Turkification of Anatolia, or merely an accelerant of trends already in motion? Regardless, its immediate consequences for Armenia were undeniably devastating. The Seljuk invasions shattered the political unity that the Bagratuni kingdom had briefly achieved and irrevocably altered the demographics and power dynamics of the Armenian highlands. It effectively ended direct Armenian rule in their ancestral heartland for centuries, forcing many to seek refuge and rebuild their lives elsewhere, particularly leading to the remarkable emergence of a vibrant new Armenian state on the Mediterranean coast. This era of profound disruption forged an even deeper sense of resilience and adaptability within the Armenian people, as they once again faced the challenge of maintaining their identity in the face of overwhelming foreign domination. As the heartland of historical Armenia reeled from the devastating Seljuk invasions and the collapse of Byzantine authority, a new beacon of Armenian self-determination began to shine hundreds of miles to the southwest, along the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean. This was the emergence of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, a remarkable testament to the Armenian people's extraordinary resilience and adaptability. Imagine a group of survivors from a great catastrophe picking themselves up, moving to a new land, and not just surviving, but thriving, building a new kingdom from scratch. It was a remarkable act of national persistence, driven by noble families who had migrated or fled the Seljuk onslaught. Cilicia, a fertile plain nestled between the Taurus Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea in what is modern-day southern Turkey, had long been home to a smaller Armenian population. However, the influx of Armenian refugees and nobles, particularly after the Seljuk devastation and the Battle of Manzikert, dramatically increased their numbers and influence. Among these migrating noble families, the Rubenids emerged as the dominant force. They were a branch of the Bagratid royal family, tracing their lineage back to the former kings of Ani. Under their leadership, these Armenian migrants and local populations began to consolidate power, establishing a semi-independent principality. The Rubenids, led by figures like Reuben Thom, and then his son Constantine the Firm, skillfully exploited the power vacuum created by the weakening Byzantine Empire and the fragmented nature of early Seljuk rule. They initially established a principality in the rugged mountainous regions of Cilicia, a natural stronghold that offered protection from external threats. From these secure bases, they gradually expanded their control over the fertile plains and coastal cities. This wasn't just a random act of squatting. It was a deliberate and strategic process of state building, turning a refuge into a thriving new homeland. What made Cilician Armenia particularly unique was its geographical location and its active engagement with the Crusades. Situated strategically on the routes between Europe and the Holy Land, Cilicia became an invaluable ally for the Crusader states established in the Levant. The Armenians of Cilicia, sharing a common Christian faith with the Crusaders, forged strong military and diplomatic ties with them. This alliance provided the nascent Armenian state with powerful Western allies, offering protection and support against both Muslim rulers and the often unpredictable Byzantines. It was a dynamic, sometimes complicated, but ultimately beneficial relationship. Imagine a small kingdom suddenly finding itself indispensable to powerful international players. It gave them leverage they might not otherwise have had. The interactions with the Crusaders and the Latin West brought significant cultural and political influences to Cilicia. Unlike the Armenian heartland, which had predominantly looked eastward, Cilician Armenia embraced many Western European feudal customs, military tactics, and even architectural styles. The Rubendid princes eventually adopted the title of king and formalized their rule along European monarchical lines. In 1198, Leo I Levandau, also known as Leo the Magnificent, was crowned King of Armenia by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and received his crown from the Pope, signifying the kingdom's official recognition by the major powers of Western Christendom. This was a hugely significant moment, cementing Cilicia's place on the European political map. Under the Rubenid dynasty, and later the Hetamids, who intermarried with the Rubenids, the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia flourished for nearly 3 centuries. It became a vibrant economic and cultural hub, renowned for its bustling ports, like Ayas, which facilitated trade between East and West. Armenian merchants played a crucial role in international commerce, exchanging goods from Asia with European markets. This prosperity fueled a rich cultural life, including significant advancements in manuscript illumination, literature, and legal codes. The Armenian Code of Law, Datastanagurk, compiled by Mgita Ghosh, was a progressive legal text for its time. It was a golden age for a new Armenian identity, blending ancient traditions with new European influences. Despite its prosperity and alliances, Cilician Armenia faced continuous external threats. It was constantly battling the Mamluks of Egypt, various Turkic emirates, and even periodic Byzantine attempts to reassert control. The Crusades, while providing allies, also entangled Cilicia in broader conflicts that sometimes proved draining. The kingdom's strategic location, which initially brought opportunities, eventually made it a target for every ambitious power in the region. It was a bit like living in a beautiful house right on a major highway, convenient for travel, but everyone else is also using it, sometimes for less than friendly purposes. Historians still argue about the extent to which Cilician Armenia represented a true continuation of the Armenian nation or a distinct, somewhat separate entity. What is undeniable is that it provided a vital sanctuary and a dynamic center for Armenian life and culture during a period when the ancestral homeland was under severe foreign domination. It preserved Armenian royalty, developed a sophisticated state, and maintained a strong Christian identity in a region increasingly surrounded by Muslim powers. The memory of this independent kingdom would become another powerful touchstone in the long Armenian narrative, a reminder that even when pushed from their ancient lands, the spirit of Armenian statehood could and would find new fertile ground to blossom. While the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia flourished on the Mediterranean coast, forging alliances with Crusader states and trading with European powers, the geopolitical chessboard of the wider Near East was once again undergoing a monumental reshuffling. From the vast echoing plains of Central Asia, another immense force was about to descend, a force that would reshape continents and empires. The Mongols, their arrival in the 13th century, marked a new and profoundly impactful chapter for the Armenian people, bringing both unprecedented destruction and, paradoxically, periods of cautious coexistence. It was like living through a series of increasingly large natural disasters, only this time the storm was global in scale, and its impact was felt everywhere. The Mongol conquests, initiated by Genghis Khan and continued by his successors, were characterized by a ferocity and efficiency that stunned the world. Their cavalry, disciplined and numbering in the hundreds of thousands, swept across Asia and into Eastern Europe and the Middle East, crushing kingdoms and empires in their path. For the fragmented Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had established itself in Anatolia and parts of the Armenian highlands, and for the various Muslim emirates that controlled much of historical Armenia, the Mongols were an unstoppable cataclysm. The first major Mongol incursions into Armenian lands began in the 1230s. The once mighty city of Ani, already ravaged by Seljuk attacks, suffered further under the Mongol onslaught. Other cities and towns across the historical Armenian highlands faced similar devastation. The Armenians, who had been under various Turkic and Muslim overlords for centuries, found themselves facing a new, terrifying master. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Widespread destruction, massacres, and the forced displacement of populations. Famines and plagues often followed in the wake of the Mongol armies, adding to the misery. However, the Mongols, while brutal conquerors, were also pragmatic rulers once their initial military objectives were achieved. They were primarily interested in tribute and loyalty, and they often employed local administrators to govern their newly acquired territories. This is where the Armenian nobility and the Armenian church played a crucial role. Recognizing the immense power of the Mongols, many Armenian princes, particularly those in the historical homeland, made the difficult decision to submit to Mongol overlordship. This was not an act of surrender, but a calculated move for survival, aiming to preserve their communities and institutions from total annihilation. Indeed, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, seeing the writing on the wall, also sought an alliance with the Mongols. King Hetam I of Cilicia, in a truly remarkable and perilous journey, traveled all the way to Karakorum, the Mongol capital in Central Asia, in 1254. He sought a formal alliance against the Mamluks of Egypt and the various Turkic groups, hoping to leverage Mongol power for Armenian security. This alliance was, at times, beneficial, with Armenian troops fighting alongside Mongol armies in their campaigns in the Levant. It was a bold gamble, an attempt to find the lesser of two evils in a world of overwhelming imperial forces. Under Mongol rule, Armenia became part of the vast Ilkhanate, a Mongol Khanate that encompassed Persia, Mesopotamia, and much of Anatolia and the Caucasus. This period brought a degree of Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, which, after the initial devastation, allowed for some stabilization and the reopening of trade routes that traversed the vast Mongol Empire. Armenian merchants, with their extensive networks, were able to capitalize on these new routes, engaging in trade that stretched from China to Europe. This economic activity provided some relief and opportunities for rebuilding. Crucially, the Mongols, being largely indifferent to the religious affiliations of their subjects, initially at least, as they followed their own traditional shamanistic beliefs, were generally tolerant of Christianity. In fact, some Mongol leaders, particularly early on, even showed a degree of favor towards Christians, viewing them as potential allies against the Muslim powers. This tolerance meant that the Armenian Church, unlike under some earlier Muslim rulers, largely enjoyed freedom of worship and organization. Monasteries and schools, though often rebuilding from ruins, could resume their activities, preserving Armenian intellectual and spiritual life. Historians still argue about the true impact of Mongol rule on Armenia. While undeniably destructive in its initial phases, it also led to a unique period where Armenians, particularly those from Cilicia, engaged directly with the Mongol world, even participating in their diplomatic missions to Europe. This interaction led to a deeper understanding of Asian cultures and technologies. However, the long-term demographic and economic effects were undeniably negative for the Armenian highlands. The repeated invasions and internal strife within the Ilkhanate eventually led to further depopulation and impoverishment of the ancestral lands. The once thriving cities often struggled to recover. Ultimately, as the Ilkhanate itself began to fragment in the late 14th century, new Turkic and Mongol successor states emerged, leading to further instability and renewed invasions, notably by Timur, Tamerlane, another destructive force who rampaged through the region. The Mongol period, though bringing a temporary shift in the balance of power, did not fundamentally alter Armenia's fate as a land caught between competing empires. It merely added another layer to the complex tapestry of foreign domination, reinforcing the Armenian people's unique ability to survive, adapt, and even find moments of opportunity amidst widespread chaos. While the Armenian homeland grappled with the ebb and flow of Mongol power and its eventual decline, the resilient Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, perched on the Mediterranean, found itself facing an increasingly existential threat. Despite its strategic alliances and periods of prosperity, this vibrant Armenian state, a testament to resilience, was now caught in the crosshairs of a formidable new regional power, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Imagine a small, flourishing island nation finding itself directly in the path of a relentless naval power with nowhere left to retreat. The fall of Cilician Armenia was not a sudden collapse, but a protracted, tragic struggle, marking the end of significant Armenian independence for centuries to come. The Mamluks, originally Turkic slave soldiers who rose to power in Egypt, had become the dominant force in the Levant after decisively defeating both the Crusaders and the Mongols in successive battles, particularly at Ain Jalut in 1260. They were fierce warriors, devout Muslims, and fiercely determined to eradicate any remaining Crusader presence and assert their control over the lucrative trade routes that passed through the region. Cilician Armenia, with its strong ties to the European Crusader states and its Christian identity, was viewed by the Mamluks as both a rival and a target. It was a juicy piece of real estate, strategically located and economically prosperous, making it too tempting for the Mamluks to ignore. The conflict between Cilician Armenia and the Mamluks was characterized by a series of devastating Mamluk invasions throughout the late 13th and 14th centuries. These were not mere raids. They were large-scale military campaigns aimed at systematically weakening and ultimately conquering the Armenian kingdom. The Mamluks, with their powerful armies and advanced siegecraft, repeatedly struck at Cilician cities and fortresses. The Armenians, despite their bravery and occasional victories, were simply outmatched by the Mamluks' superior numbers and resources. It was a bit like a heavyweight boxer constantly fighting against a much larger, more powerful opponent. Eventually, sheer attrition takes its toll. The city of Ayas, Cilicia's most important port and a bustling center of international trade, became a frequent target. Its fall and repeated sackings were a severe blow to the kingdom's economy, disrupting its vital commercial links with Europe. The Mamluks also captured and destroyed other key cities and fortresses, systematically dismantling the Armenian defensive network. Each invasion further depleted Armenian manpower resources, and morale. The internal struggles within the Armenian nobility and the royal family, a recurring weakness, also hampered their ability to present a united front against the external threat. Adding to Cilicia's woes was the waning support from its traditional European allies. The Crusader fervor had largely dissipated, and European powers were increasingly preoccupied with their own internal affairs and conflicts. While some limited aid occasionally arrived, it was rarely enough to turn the tide against the relentless Mamluk pressure. The promised grand crusades that might have saved Cilicia never fully materialized, leaving the kingdom isolated and vulnerable. It was like being in a desperate fight, calling for backup, and hearing nothing but static on the other end. The final demise of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia came in the 1375. After a prolonged siege, the Mamluk forces captured Sis, the capital of Cilician Armenia. The last king, Leo V of Lusignan, a descendant of the royal family who had some European lineage, was captured and taken to Cairo, where he eventually died in exile. With the fall of Sis, the independent Armenian monarchy, which had persevered for nearly 3 centuries in Cilicia, ceased to exist. It was a somber moment, marking the end of an independent Armenian state for a very, very long time. The aftermath of the fall was devastating for Cilician Armenians. Many were killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. The region became predominantly Muslim, with Turkic and Arab populations increasing, while significant Armenian communities persisted in Cilicia for centuries. They were no longer sovereign. The destruction of urban centers and the disruption of trade led to a severe decline in the region's prosperity. The vibrant cultural life that had flourished under the Rubenids and Hetamids faded, though the Armenian Church and its monasteries continued their crucial work of preserving language and identity in scattered communities. The fall of Cilician Armenia represented a profound loss for the Armenian people. It meant the absence of an independent Armenian political entity, a voice on the international stage, and a center of state-sponsored cultural development. The Armenian nation, scattered and under foreign domination in both its ancestral homeland and its Cilician refuge, entered a long period of statelessness. The memory of Cilicia, however, became another cherished chapter in the Armenian historical narrative, a testament to their ability to adapt, innovate, and thrive even when forced from their original lands. It joined the legacy of Tigranes the Great and the Bagratunis Kingdom as a powerful reminder of past glory and a source of national inspiration for future generations. With the definitive fall of the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia in 1375, the Armenian people entered one of the longest and most challenging periods in their long history. Centuries of continuous foreign domination without an independent state of their own. For the ancestral Armenian highlands, this meant being caught in the relentless geopolitical tug-of-war between 2 emerging behemoths, the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Safavid Empire of Persia to the east. Imagine being a patch of prized land directly on a fault line between 2 massive, constantly shifting tectonic plates. The tremors, the pressures, and the occasional violent quakes become a part of everyday life. This ongoing strife profoundly shaped the fate of the Armenian homeland and its people. The Ottoman Empire, emerging from Anatolia, steadily grew in power and ambition, eventually conquering Constantinople in 1453 and establishing itself as a dominant force in the Islamic world and beyond. The Safavid Empire, founded in Persia in the early 16th century, revitalized Iranian power and, importantly, established Shia Islam as its state religion, providing a distinct ideological counterpoint to the Sunni Ottoman Empire. These two vast empires, each believing itself to be the rightful inheritor of regional hegemony, engaged in a protracted series of wars that spanned centuries, turning the Armenian highlands into a perpetual battleground. Armenia once again found itself as a crucial frontier zone, its strategic location making it both a prize and a buffer. Both the Ottomans and the Safavids sought to control the region for military and economic reasons. The Ottoman-Safavid wars were frequent and devastating. Armies marched back and forth across Armenian territory, cities were besieged and sacked, and agricultural lands were laid waste. The local Armenian population bore the brunt of these conflicts, suffering from massacres, forced displacements, and economic ruin. It was a cycle of destruction that seemed to have no end, leaving the land impoverished and its people in constant fear. Perhaps the most notorious example of this devastation was the Great Surgun, Great Exile, or Shah Abbas's deportations in the early 17th century. Shah Abbas I, the powerful Safavid ruler, adopted a scorched earth policy to deny resources to the advancing Ottomans. He ordered the forced deportation of hundreds of thousands of Armenians and other Christian populations from their ancestral lands in eastern Armenia to the Persian interior, particularly to the new capital of Isfahan. The journey was brutal, with countless lives lost due to starvation, disease, and harsh conditions. Imagine being forcibly uprooted from your home, your entire community, and made to march hundreds of miles into an unknown land. It was a traumatic experience, meant to break the spirit and deny the Ottomans any advantage. However, even in this tragic episode, Armenian resilience shone through. The deported Armenians, especially those settled in New Julfa outside Isfahan, quickly established themselves as highly successful merchants and traders. Their networks, extending from India to Europe, became vital to the Safavid economy, and they were granted considerable autonomy and religious freedom. This diaspora community thrived, building magnificent churches and schools and preserving Armenian culture far from their homeland. This demonstrated an incredible ability to adapt and rebuild, turning profound adversity into a new opportunity, albeit one born from immense suffering. It's almost like a plant that, when cut, simply grows new roots elsewhere. Meanwhile, the historical Armenian highlands became formally divided between the two empires. Western Armenia, roughly corresponding to Eastern Anatolia, fell under Ottoman rule, while Eastern Armenia, corresponding to parts of modern-day Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Iran, was under Safavid control. This division meant that Armenians on opposite sides of the border often experienced different forms of governance, taxation, and cultural pressures. Those under Ottoman rule were part of the millet system, which allowed some religious autonomy, while those under Safavid rule had varying degrees of freedom. The Armenian Church, specifically the Catholicosate of Echmiadzin in eastern Armenia, and the Catholicosate of Cilicia, which, after the fall of the kingdom, continued as an ecclesiastical center, became ever more crucial as unifying institutions. In the absence of a state, the Church served as the primary custodian of Armenian identity, language, and culture. It preserved ancient manuscripts, maintained schools, and provided spiritual and community leadership. It was the unwavering backbone of the nation, providing continuity through centuries of foreign rule. Historians still argue about the long-term demographic effects of these protracted wars and deportations. While undoubtedly devastating, Armenian communities persisted in their historical homeland, albeit in reduced numbers in many areas. The continuous movement of armies and the imposition of foreign rule also led to a stagnation of urban life and a decline in agriculture in many parts of the highlands. The centuries of Ottoman-Safavid strife solidified Armenia's status as a contested frontier, a land whose people had to constantly adapt to shifting geopolitical winds, maintaining their distinct identity in the shadow of two powerful, often warring empires. It was a harsh test of endurance, one that the Armenian people, against all odds, largely passed. As the Ottoman and Safavid empires continued their seemingly endless struggle for control over the Armenian highlands, the Armenians living under Ottoman rule found themselves adapting to a distinct administrative system that, while offering a degree of religious autonomy, also solidified their status as a minority within a vast, multi-ethnic empire. This was the Ottoman millet system, a unique framework that shaped the daily lives, rights, and responsibilities of non-Muslim communities for centuries. Imagine a vast, diverse household where each major family group has its own designated living space, rules, and internal governance, all under the overarching authority of the head of the house. That, in essence, was the millet system. The word millet, pronounced millet, is an Arabic term meaning nation or community. In the Ottoman context, it referred to separate religious communities recognized by the state. Each millet was granted the right to govern its internal affairs according to its own religious laws and customs. For the Armenians, this meant that the Armenian Apostolic Church became the central organizing body for the Armenian millet. The Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople, residing in the Ottoman capital, served as the spiritual and secular head of the entire Armenian community within the empire, responsible for collecting taxes, administering justice in civil matters like marriage, divorce, and inheritance, and managing schools and charitable institutions. This system, while outwardly appearing tolerant, had both advantages and disadvantages for the Armenians. On the one hand, it allowed them to preserve their distinct religious identity, language, and cultural traditions. The church was empowered to maintain schools where Armenian language and history were taught, ensuring the continuity of their heritage. Armenians could practice their faith openly, build churches, and educate their clergy. This provided a crucial institutional framework for survival in the absence of an independent state. It was a lifeline for their identity, preventing forced assimilation into the broader Muslim society. However, the millet system also placed Armenians in a subordinate position as dhimmis, protected non-Muslims. While protected, they faced certain legal and social restrictions compared to their Muslim counterparts. They were often excluded from military service, though they paid a special tax in lieu of it, faced limitations on building new churches or repairing old ones, and their testimony in court against a Muslim was often discounted. Socially, they were sometimes subject to discrimination and had to demonstrate deference. It was a clear hierarchy, even if it wasn't always overtly oppressive. Imagine being told, "You're welcome to stay, but you have to use the side entrance, and you can't join certain clubs." Economically, Armenians often thrived within the Ottoman system. Their extensive trade networks, honed over centuries, allowed them to play a disproportionately significant role in the empire's commerce, banking and crafts. Many Armenian merchants became wealthy and influential, operating across vast distances from the Ottoman heartland to Europe, Persia, and beyond. They became indispensable to the imperial economy, particularly in cities like Constantinople, Smyrna, Izmir, and Trebizond. This economic success, however, sometimes bred resentment among other communities, creating tensions that would unfortunately surface later. The geography of Ottoman Armenia, Western Armenia, meant that its communities were often spread across mountainous and sometimes isolated regions, making communication and unified action challenging. Major Armenian population centers included historical cities like Van, Erzurum, and Diyarbakir, as well as numerous towns and villages in the provinces of Anatolia. While relatively stable under the millet system for centuries, these communities were always vulnerable to the whims of local governors, Kurdish tribal incursions, and the broader political instability of the declining Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman Empire entered its long period of decline from the 18th century onwards, the millet system, once a source of stability, began to show its cracks. Central authority weakened, and corruption and arbitrary rule by local officials increased. The rise of nationalism in the 19th century, both among the empire's Christian minorities, Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and among the ruling Turks, put immense pressure on the traditional Ottoman multi-religious framework. The Armenians, seeking greater rights and reforms, found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Historians still argue about the true nature of the millet system. Was it primarily a pragmatic administrative tool for a multi-religious empire, or a discriminatory system designed to maintain Muslim supremacy? It was likely a bit of both, evolving over time. What is undeniable is that for centuries, it provided the framework within which the Armenian people largely survived as a distinct religious and cultural entity under Ottoman rule. It allowed the Armenian Church to continue its role as the guardian of national identity, keeping the flame of Armenian heritage alive through generations of foreign domination, even as external pressures and internal weaknesses would eventually lead to tragic consequences. While large swathes of the Armenian homeland remained under Ottoman rule, another colossal power was steadily expanding its influence across Eurasia, the Russian Empire. From the 18th century onwards, Russia's southward push into the Caucasus region, driven by imperial ambition, religious affinity, and strategic interests, began to directly impact the fate of the Armenians. For many Armenians, particularly those living under Persian or Ottoman control, Russia, as a fellow Christian power, initially appeared as a potential liberator, a powerful ally against centuries of Muslim domination. It was like living under a harsh landlord and suddenly seeing a seemingly benevolent new neighbor moving in next door, promising to help you with your problems. Russia's expansion into the Caucasus was a protracted affair, marked by a series of wars with both the Ottoman and Persian empires. The Armenians, caught geographically between these warring giants, often found themselves having to choose sides, or more often, having sides chosen for them. During these conflicts, many Armenians, particularly those in eastern Armenia under Persian rule, actively supported the Russian advance. They provided intelligence, served as guides, and even formed volunteer militias, hoping that Russian victory would lead to their emancipation and the restoration of an Armenian state. or at least significantly improved conditions. A pivotal moment came with the Russo-Persian War of 1826-1828 and the subsequent Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828. This treaty resulted in Persia ceding significant territories in the Caucasus to Russia, including the entire territory of what is largely modern-day Armenia, including the cities of Yerevan and Nakhchivan. This meant that for the first time in centuries, a substantial portion of the historical Armenian homeland was united under a single Christian power. This was greeted with immense relief and hope by the local Armenian population. Many Armenians from Persian territories, and even some from Ottoman lands, migrated to Russian Armenia, seeking refuge and a new life under Christian rule. However, the reality of Russian rule, while certainly different from Ottoman or Persian domination, was not a utopian liberation. The Tsarist regime, while nominally Orthodox Christian, was also an autocratic empire with its own imperial designs. Armenians, though no longer dhimmis, found themselves subject to the policies of Russification, which aimed to integrate diverse populations into the Russian cultural and administrative system. This meant Russian language in schools and administration, and efforts to bring the Armenian Church under closer control of the Russian Orthodox Church, something that the fiercely independent Armenian Apostolic Church resisted. It was like escaping one set of rules, only to find yourself under a different but equally rigid set of regulations. Despite these pressures, Russian Armenia experienced a period of relative stability and economic development. The absence of constant warfare that plagued Ottoman Armenia allowed for population growth, agricultural recovery, and the growth of new urban centers. Tiflis, modern-day Tbilisi in Georgia, though not in Armenia proper, became a major cultural and intellectual hub for Armenians, as did Yerevan. Armenian intellectuals and nationalist figures began to emerge, advocating for greater rights and cultural autonomy within the Russian Empire, and even for the eventual unification of all Armenian lands. The late 19th century, however, saw a shift in Russian policy that caused growing disillusionment among Armenians. Fearful of Armenian nationalism and its potential to destabilize the region, and under the influence of reactionary elements, the Tsarist government began to implement more repressive measures. Armenian schools were closed or forced to adopt Russian curricula, and the properties of the Armenian Church were confiscated. This unexpected betrayal of what many Armenians had hoped would be a benevolent protector led to significant resentment and fueled a nascent Armenian revolutionary movement, particularly those advocating for self-defense and greater autonomy against both Ottoman and Russian oppression. This Russian expansion also intensified the Armenian question on the international stage. As Russia gained more territory in the Caucasus, it became a champion of the Christian minorities within the Ottoman Empire, ostensibly to protect them, but often as a pretext for further territorial gains. This put the Ottoman Armenians in an even more precarious position, as the Ottoman government increasingly viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as potential fifth columnists allied with Russia. It was a dangerous game of imperial chess, with the Armenian people as the pawns. Historians still argue whether Russian intervention was genuinely benevolent, or simply a cynical ploy to weaken the Ottomans. Regardless of intent, its immediate effect was to draw more international attention to the plight of Armenians. Ultimately, the period of Russian expansion brought a mixed bag for Armenians. On one hand, it liberated a significant portion of their historical homeland from centuries of Ottoman and Persian rule, leading to a degree of stability and cultural revival. On the other hand, it introduced new forms of imperial control and repression, shattering the illusion of a purely benevolent Christian protector. It set the stage for the complex geopolitical maneuvers that would define the Armenian experience in the lead-up to the 20th century, cementing their place as a people caught between the competing ambitions of great powers. As the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century dawned, the aspirations of the Armenian people for reform and self-determination clashed violently with the brutal realities of a crumbling Ottoman Empire. The romantic notion of a Christian protector in Russia began to fray, and the stirrings of Armenian national awakening were met with increasingly severe repression, culminating in horrifying acts of violence. Imagine a gentle breeze of hope turning into a suffocating storm, as long-simmering tensions finally boiled over into outright brutality. The late 19th century was a period of intense change and rising nationalism across the Ottoman Empire. Various Christian minorities, inspired by European Enlightenment ideals and aided by external powers, had already achieved independence or significant autonomy. Think of Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria. The Armenians, witnessing these developments and facing increasing economic hardship and insecurity in their traditional homelands, also began to articulate demands for reforms. These demands were not initially for outright independence, but rather for basic security, fair taxation, an end to arbitrary violence by local Kurdish chieftains and corrupt officials, and greater representation within the Ottoman system. They merely asked for the rule of law, a concept that was becoming increasingly foreign to the decentralized and weakening imperial administration. However, the Ottoman government, under the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, viewed these Armenian demands with profound suspicion. Influenced by pan-Turkic ideologies and a deep-seated fear of dismemberment, having already lost vast territories, the Sultan and his advisors saw Armenian aspirations as a direct threat to the integrity of the empire. They perceived Armenians, especially those who had received European education or engaged with revolutionary committees, as disloyal elements, potentially allied with Russia or European powers eager to carve up Ottoman territory. This paranoia, unfortunately, provided a convenient pretext for repression. The result was a series of horrific massacres that prefigured the catastrophe to come. The most prominent of these were the Hamidian massacres of 1894-1896. These orchestrated attacks, often carried out by local irregulars, Kurdish tribes, and even Ottoman soldiers, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Armenians across the Ottoman Empire. The scale of the violence was immense, targeting Armenian villages, churches, and urban communities. These were not random acts. They were systematic campaigns of terror designed to crush Armenian aspirations and punish them for their perceived disloyalty. Imagine entire towns being put to the torch, with no one to protect the innocent. Even after the Hamidian massacres, the tensions continued to simmer, reaching another boiling point with the Adana massacres of 1909. This outbreak of violence occurred in the Cilicia region, an area where Armenian communities had a long history and where the Ottoman counter-revolutionaries clashed with supporters of the newly restored constitution. In April 1909, an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 Armenians were killed in the city of Adana and its surrounding areas. This event was particularly shocking because it occurred after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which had promised a new era of equality and constitutional rule for all Ottoman subjects. The Adana massacres revealed that deep-seated anti-Armenian prejudices and state-sanctioned violence were still very much alive, even under a seemingly more liberal government. Historians still argue whether the Adana massacres were purely a local uprising or a planned event by elements within the collapsing Ottoman establishment. What is clear is their devastating impact. These massacres served as a chilling precursor to the horrors of the Armenian genocide. They demonstrated the Ottoman government's increasing willingness to use extreme violence against its own Armenian citizens, and the relative impunity with which such acts were carried out. International protests often proved ineffective, offering little more than diplomatic condemnation, which the Ottoman authorities largely ignored. The world watched, perhaps with sympathy, but did little to intervene. A tragic precedent that would echo in the years to come. Amidst this rising tide of violence, Armenian political parties and revolutionary groups began to emerge. Organizations like the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Dashnaktsutyon, and the Hunchakian Party were formed, initially advocating for reforms and self-defense within the empire. However, as the violence escalated and hopes for peaceful reform dwindled, some factions began to push for more radical solutions, including armed resistance and, for some, eventual independence. These groups, often operating from outside the Ottoman Empire, sought to mobilize Armenians and draw international attention to their plight. Their activities, however, were often used by the Ottoman authorities as further justification for their repressive policies, feeding into a vicious cycle of suspicion and violence. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a truly perilous time for the Armenians. The dream of a unified, secure nation, whether under Russian protection or through internal Ottoman reform, seemed to be slipping away. Instead, they faced a stark reality: a declining empire increasingly prone to violence against its Christian minorities, and a world largely unwilling to intervene effectively. The rising tensions, the Hamidian and Adana massacres, and the general atmosphere of fear laid the grim groundwork for the ultimate catastrophe that would soon engulf the Armenian nation, a tragedy that would forever alter their demographic and geographical presence in their ancient homeland. The relentless pressure, the periodic massacres, and the increasingly fervent nationalism within the Ottoman Empire created an unbearable pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow off. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided the perfect, catastrophic cover for the Ottoman government, now largely controlled by the radical triumvirate of the Committee of Union and Progress, KUP, also known as the Young Turks, to implement their final solution to the Armenian question. This wasn't just another massacre. It was a systematic, state-orchestrated campaign of extermination, the Armenian genocide. Imagine a terrifying storm that had been brewing for decades, finally unleashing its full, devastating fury, deliberately sweeping away an entire people. The Young Turks, driven by a potent mix of Turkic nationalism, Pan-Turanian ideology, the idea of uniting all Turkic peoples, and a deep-seated paranoia about internal enemies, viewed the Armenians as an existential threat to the integrity and future of the Ottoman Empire. They suspected Armenians of disloyalty, of conspiring with Russia, their wartime enemy, and of hindering their vision of a homogeneous Turkic state. The fact that many Armenian intellectuals and political figures advocated for reform or autonomy, or that some Armenians in the Russian Empire fought against the Ottomans, was used as a pretext for collective punishment against the entire Armenian population within the Ottoman borders. It was a classic case of blaming the victim, then eliminating them. The genocide began subtly, then escalated rapidly. First, in early 1915, Armenian soldiers serving in the Ottoman army were disarmed, segregated into labor battalions, and then systematically executed. This eliminated the most capable male population and potential defenders. Imagine being called to serve your country, only to have your uniform become your death shroud. This left Armenian communities virtually defenseless. Then came the infamous deportation orders, ostensibly for military necessity or security reasons. Beginning in the spring and summer of 1915, Armenians were rounded up from their homes across Anatolia and the historical Armenian highlands. They were forced onto long, brutal death marches, primarily towards the Syrian desert, particularly to concentration camps in places like Deir ez-Zor. These marches were not about relocation. They were designed to kill. Deportees were given little to no food or water, stripped of their possessions, and subjected to horrific conditions. They were constantly attacked by Ottoman soldiers, gendarmerie, and irregulars, including Kurdish and Circassian gangs. Women were raped, children abducted, and the elderly and infirm left to die by the roadside. Rivers became choked with bodies. It was an industrial-scale horror, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. The objective was clear: the complete annihilation of the Armenian presence in the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't accidental collateral damage of war. It was a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing and genocide. The Ottoman government established special organization units, Teşkilat-i Mahsusa, to carry out the massacres. Orders were sent, often in coded language, to provincial governors and military commanders, instructing them to implement the deportations and the accompanying massacres, while the direct orders for extermination were often veiled. The intent was unmistakable in the horrific outcomes. The scale of the atrocities was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1 million and 1.5 million Armenians perished during the genocide. Entire towns and villages were emptied of their Armenian inhabitants, their churches and homes often destroyed or repurposed. The ancient Armenian presence in Anatolia and the historic highlands, which had endured for thousands of years, was virtually wiped out. The few survivors were those who managed to hide, were protected by compassionate neighbors at immense personal risk, or were forcibly converted to Islam and assimilated. The international response was tragically limited. News of the atrocities reached the Allied powers and the United States, and there were diplomatic protests and expressions of outrage. American missionaries and diplomats, like Henry Morgenthau Sr., the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, documented the horrors in stark detail, calling it a campaign of race extermination. However, preoccupied with the global war, no major power intervened militarily to stop the genocide. This inaction became a grim precedent for future genocides, tragically demonstrating that moral condemnation often falls short without concrete intervention. The Armenian genocide remains a deeply painful and defining event for the Armenian people, often referred to as the Medz-Yegan Great Catastrophe. Its denial by successive Turkish governments has been a continuous source of international tension and profound pain for Armenians worldwide. The memory of the genocide has shaped the Armenian diaspora and continues to be a central pillar of Armenian national identity, a solemn vow to remember those lost and to seek justice and recognition. It forged an even deeper sense of collective grief and determination to ensure such an atrocity never happens again. The systematic elimination of a people based on their ethnicity and religion stands as a stark warning from history, echoing the very real and immediate dangers of unchecked nationalism and state-sponsored hatred. Amidst the unimaginable horror and devastation of the Armenian genocide, as the Ottoman Empire sought to eradicate its Armenian population, a flicker of hope, born from desperation and opportunity, emerged from the chaos of World War I. With the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, triggered by the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian armies that had occupied parts of eastern Armenia suddenly withdrew. This created a perilous power vacuum, but also an unprecedented, if fleeting, chance for the Armenians of the Caucasus to forge their own destiny. This was the birth of the First Republic of Armenia, a brief, embattled period of independence, a fragile bloom in a war-torn landscape. It was like finding a tiny, resilient sprout pushing through cracked concrete after a cataclysmic earthquake. For centuries, Armenians in the Russian Empire had largely been loyal subjects, albeit with growing nationalistic aspirations. When Tsarist rule collapsed, replaced by the revolutionary turmoil of Bolshevik Russia, the Transcaucasus region, comprising Armenians, Georgians, and Azeris, initially formed a Transcaucasian federation. However, deep-seated ethnic and political differences, coupled with the immediate military threat from the advancing Ottoman armies, quickly led to its dissolution. Each nation, in a desperate race against time and Ottoman expansion, declared its own independence. Thus, on May 28, 1918, the First Republic of Armenia was proclaimed. This was a monumental, albeit bittersweet, moment. After more than 6 centuries without an independent state, and in the shadow of the ongoing genocide in Ottoman Armenia, a small portion of the historical Armenian homeland once again had a sovereign government. Its capital was Yerevan, a city that would forever after be associated with independent Armenia. Imagine the immense pride and profound trepidation of founding a nation under such dire circumstances, surrounded by enemies and reeling from unimaginable loss. The challenges facing the fledgling republic were immense, bordering on insurmountable. First and foremost was the continuing military threat. The Ottoman armies, having advanced through the Caucasus after the Russian withdrawal, were pressing hard on the new republic's borders. The Armenians, still recovering from the genocide and with their best military leaders often serving in the Russian army, had to fight for their very survival. They managed to achieve a crucial, albeit costly, victory at the Battle of Sadarapat in May 1918, which halted the Ottoman advance and saved Yerevan from capture. This battle became a foundational myth for the Republic, a testament to Armenian courage in the face of annihilation. Beyond the Ottoman threat, the Republic also faced external pressures from its other neighbors. Border disputes and military clashes with newly independent Georgia and Azerbaijan were constant. Internally, the Republic grappled with a massive refugee crisis as tens of thousands of Armenian survivors from Ottoman Turkey poured into its limited territory, starving and diseased. The economy was in ruins, infrastructure was non-existent, and there was rampant famine and disease. It was a nation built on hope, but desperately short on resources and stability. The political landscape of the First Republic was dominated by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Dashnaktsutyon, a nationalist party that had been active for decades. They attempted to establish a democratic parliamentary system and worked tirelessly to secure international recognition and aid. Delegations were sent to the Paris Peace Conference, advocating for a unified, independent Armenia that would include the Armenian-populated territories of Ottoman Turkey. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which envisioned a larger Armenia with access to the Black Sea, offered a glimmer of hope, but it was never ratified and ultimately proved to be a cruel illusion. The international environment was simply too unstable. The Allied powers, exhausted by the war, were unwilling to commit the necessary resources to enforce a larger Armenian state. Meanwhile, a resurgent Turkish nationalist movement under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was consolidating power in Anatolia, actively rejecting the terms of Sèvres. From the north, the Bolsheviks, having won the Russian Civil War, were also looking to reassert control over the Caucasus. Caught between the Kemalist Turks to the west and the advancing Red Army to the north, the First Republic of Armenia found itself in an impossible squeeze. In September 1920, Turkey launched a renewed invasion of Armenia. The Armenians, exhausted and abandoned by their hoped-for international allies, suffered devastating defeats. Simultaneously, the Bolsheviks, seeing their opportunity, advanced into Armenia. Faced with a two-front war against overwhelming odds, the government of the First Republic of Armenia ultimately collapsed. On December 1920, the Red Army entered Yerevan, and Armenia was declared a Soviet Socialist Republic. The First Republic lasted a mere 2.5 years, a brief interlude of independence in a long history of foreign rule. Yet its significance cannot be overstated. It represented the first modern attempt at Armenian statehood, a concrete manifestation of national aspirations. Its struggle, its heroes, and its tragic demise became a powerful part of the Armenian national narrative, a painful yet inspiring reminder of the possibility, however fleeting, of self-determination. Historians still argue whether the Republic's collapse was inevitable, given the geopolitical circumstances, or if different choices could have prolonged its existence. What is certain is that its memory fueled the hopes of future generations for a truly independent Armenian nation. With the collapse of the First Republic of Armenia, the Armenian people, having briefly tasted the sweet, albeit bitter, fruit of independence, found themselves once again under foreign rule. This time, the dominant power was the Soviet Union, a vast ideological empire that would shape Armenia's destiny for the next 7 decades. Imagine stepping from one oppressive storm into another, vastly different but equally encompassing system. This wasn't a military occupation in the traditional sense, but an ideological absorption, transforming Armenia into a Soviet Socialist Republic, a component part of a grand communist experiment. In December 1920, the Red Army marched into Yerevan, and the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic ASSR, was formally established. This incorporation into the Soviet Union was initially seen by some as a necessary evil, a way to prevent complete annihilation by a resurgent Turkey. For others, it was a betrayal of their hard-won independence. The new Soviet regime, led by the Bolsheviks, quickly set about reorganizing society along communist lines, implementing collectivization of agriculture, industrialization, and suppressing political dissent. The Dashnaktsutun party, which had led the First Republic, was outlawed, and many of its members were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The immediate post-Republic years were marked by purges and the consolidation of Soviet power. Despite the loss of political sovereignty, Soviet rule brought a degree of stability and, perhaps surprisingly, a significant period of cultural and educational development for Armenia. The Soviet government invested heavily in industrialization, particularly in the production of chemicals, machinery, and textiles. Large-scale infrastructure projects, including hydroelectric power plants, transformed the landscape and brought modern amenities to previously rural areas. Urban centers, especially Yerevan, grew rapidly, becoming hubs of industry and population. It was like a forced, rapid modernization program, where progress came at the cost of individual liberties. Education was also a major focus. Literacy rates, which had been low, dramatically increased as a comprehensive public education system was established, emphasizing science, mathematics, and, of course, Marxist-Leninist ideology. Armenian language and literature were formally taught, and new universities and scientific institutes were founded. While the curriculum was strictly controlled by Moscow, this unprecedented access to education created a highly educated populace. The Soviet era also saw a flourishing of Armenian arts, music, and cinema, albeit under the watchful eye of state censorship. Composers, writers, and artists found avenues for expression even as they navigated the ideological constraints of the regime. Historians still argue whether the cultural flowering under Soviet rule was a genuine renaissance or a carefully managed facade. However, life under Soviet rule was far from idyllic. The infamous Stalinist purges of the 1930s hit Armenia hard, just as they did other Soviet republics. Thousands of Armenian intellectuals, party officials, and clergy were arrested, imprisoned, or executed on fabricated charges of nationalism or anti-Soviet activities. The Armenian Apostolic Church, a symbol of national identity for centuries, faced severe repression. Churches were closed, property confiscated, and many clergy were persecuted, echoing the earlier struggles under the Sasanians. The goal was to dismantle any independent institution that could challenge the authority of the Communist Party. Armenia's borders within the Soviet Union were also a complex issue. The disputed regions of Nagorno-Karabakh and Nakhchivan, historically populated by Armenians but assigned to Soviet Azerbaijan, became sources of persistent tension. The Azerbaijani SSR's control over these enclaves, despite their majority Armenian populations in Karabakh, was a constant grievance for Armenians, a historical injustice that simmered beneath the surface of Soviet friendship of peoples. It was like drawing a seemingly arbitrary line on a map that ignored centuries of demographic reality. During World War II, the Great Patriotic War for Soviets, Armenia played a significant role, contributing hundreds of thousands of soldiers to the Red Army. Many Armenians fought bravely against Nazi Germany, with disproportionately high casualty rates. This shared sacrifice fostered a sense of unity with other Soviet peoples against a common enemy. The post-war period saw some loosening of ideological controls, particularly after Stalin's death, and a renewed emphasis on national cultures, albeit within the Soviet framework. By the 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to decline, the long-suppressed national aspirations of Armenians, particularly concerning Nagorno-Karabakh, began to resurface. The calls for glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, by Mikhail Gorbachev inadvertently unleashed these pent-up frustrations. The Armenian people, having lived under a system that provided stability and some cultural development, but at the cost of freedom and self-determination, were now ready for a change. The Soviet period, despite its hardships, had inadvertently preserved a unified Armenian identity within a single administrative unit, allowing it to emerge with a stronger sense of nationhood when the opportunity for true independence finally arose. As the colossal Soviet Union, seemingly immutable for decades, began to groan under the weight of its own economic stagnation and internal contradictions, the winds of change swept across its vast expanse. For Armenia, this global upheaval presented an unforeseen, almost miraculous, opportunity to reclaim the sovereignty that had been lost for so long. The late 1980s and early 1990s witnessed a profound transformation from a tightly controlled Soviet republic to a vibrant, if embattled, independent nation. It was like a long-dormant volcano, after decades of quiet, finally stirring back to life, releasing immense pressure and reshaping the surrounding landscape. The catalyst for Armenia's re-emergence onto the world stage as an independent state was multifaceted. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, intended to reform the Soviet system, inadvertently unleashed powerful forces of nationalism and dissent across the republics. For Armenians, the most pressing issue that burst into the open was the long-simmering conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. This mountainous region, historically Armenian populated, but arbitrarily placed under Azerbaijani Soviet rule, became a rallying cry for national self-determination. In 1988, the Armenian population of Karabakh demanded unification with Armenia, triggering widespread protests and a burgeoning national movement in Yerevan. The Karabakh movement quickly transformed into a broader movement for Armenian independence. Massive, peaceful demonstrations in Yerevan, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of thousands, signaled the Armenian people's fervent desire for self-rule and an end to Soviet control. These public displays of national unity, previously unimaginable under strict Soviet censorship, demonstrated the depth of nationalist sentiment. It was like watching a dam break, as years of suppressed desires suddenly flooded into the open. However, this period was also marked by increasing ethnic tensions and violence, particularly between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Pogroms against Armenians in Azerbaijani cities like Sumgait, 1988, and Baku, 1990, sent shockwaves through the Armenian population, fueling fears for their safety and reinforcing the necessity of self-defense. These atrocities intensified the Karabakh conflict, which soon escalated from political protests to armed conflict. The Soviet central government's inability or unwillingness to effectively resolve the escalating ethnic strife further discredited Moscow's authority and fueled desires for full independence. Adding to the turmoil, A devastating earthquake struck Armenia in December 1988, particularly affecting the cities of Spitak, Leninakan, Gyumri, and Kirovakan, Vanadzor. The earthquake killed tens of thousands and left hundreds of thousands homeless, exposing the inadequacies of the Soviet response and further uniting the Armenian people in shared tragedy and a demand for self-reliance. The international aid that poured in, circumventing Soviet channels, also gave the Armenians a taste of global solidarity and a sense of direct connection to the outside world, bypassing the Soviet intermediary. As the Soviet Union continued its rapid disintegration, marked by failed coups and declarations of independence by various republics, Armenia moved decisively towards its own sovereignty. On August 23, 1990, the Armenian Supreme Soviet adopted the Declaration of Independence, renaming the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Republic of Armenia. This was a formal step, but the final decisive moment came with the nationwide referendum on independence on September 20th, 1991. An overwhelming majority of Armenians voted for full independence from the Soviet Union. Just months later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, and the Republic of Armenia took its place as a fully sovereign state on the international stage. The birth of modern Armenia was not without immediate and profound challenges. The ongoing Nagorno-Karabakh war against Azerbaijan intensified, becoming a full-scale conflict with heavy casualties and significant territorial changes. Armenia faced a devastating energy blockade imposed by Azerbaijan and Turkey, crippling its economy and plunging the nation into darkness and cold for years. The country had to transition from a centrally planned Soviet economy to a market economy, a painful process that led to widespread unemployment and hardship. It was truly a case of out of the frying pan into the fire, but this time they were masters of their own destiny. Despite these immense difficulties, the early years of independence were marked by incredible national spirit and resilience. Armenians around the world, the vast diaspora, rallied to support the fledgling state, providing humanitarian aid, investments, and diplomatic support. The dream of independent statehood, nurtured for centuries through foreign rule and genocide, had finally been realized. This era solidified the capital, Yerevan, as the vibrant heart of the new nation, a city that pulsed with renewed hope and the weight of history. The challenges of nation building were immense, but for the first time in centuries, Armenians had the arduous yet exhilarating task of building their own future. The newfound independence of Armenia, while a momentous achievement, immediately thrust the young nation into a crucible of profound challenges, the most pressing and defining of which was the full-scale Nagorno-Karabakh War. This conflict, born from the ethnic tensions and historical grievances that simmered beneath the Soviet facade, became an existential struggle for Armenia, consuming its resources, shaping its foreign policy, and deeply impacting its societal fabric. It was like finally setting sail on your own ship, only to find yourself immediately caught in a violent, prolonged storm that threatened to capsize everything. The roots of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict are long and complex, dating back to the Soviet decision in 1923 to assign the predominantly Armenian-populated autonomous oblast of Nagorno-Karabakh to the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic. For decades, Armenians in Karabakh had appealed to Moscow to be united with Armenia. but their pleas were consistently denied. With the advent of glasnost and perestroika in the late 1980s, these long-suppressed demands burst into the open, leading to protests, counter-protests, and eventually escalating violence between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. By 1991, as the Soviet Union dissolved, the conflict transitioned from inter-ethnic clashes into a full-blown war between the newly independent Republic of Armenia, supporting the local Karabakh Armenian forces, and the Republic of Azerbaijan. The Karabakh Armenians, with backing from Armenia, declared their own independence, establishing the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, Artsakh. Though this entity remains largely unrecognized internationally, the conflict was brutal and intense, characterized by heavy artillery shelling, airstrikes, and fierce ground combat. Both sides suffered significant casualties, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced, creating a massive refugee crisis for both Armenia and Azerbaijan. The war lasted until a ceasefire agreement in May 1994, largely brokered by Russia. By this time, the Armenian forces, including those from Nagorno-Karabakh and support from Armenia, had gained control not only of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, but also of 7 surrounding Azerbaijani districts. These territories, often referred to as a security belt, were intended to provide a buffer zone and a land bridge between Armenia and Karabakh. This military victory came at an immense cost for Armenia, which was simultaneously grappling with economic collapse, an energy blockade, and the painful transition from communism. Imagine fighting a total war while simultaneously trying to build a new country from the ground up, with no electricity and limited food. The economic consequences for Armenia were dire. Azerbaijan and Turkey imposed a severe economic blockade, closing their borders with Armenia. This crippled Armenia's economy, as its primary trade routes were severed, and access to energy resources was severely restricted. Factories shut down, unemployment soared, and for several years in the early 1990s, the country experienced extreme energy shortages, leading to long, cold winters without heating or electricity. This period, often called the Dark and Cold Years by Armenians, tested the nation's resolve to its absolute limits. Despite the hardships, the Armenian people demonstrated remarkable resilience. The extensive Armenian diaspora around the world mobilized, providing crucial humanitarian aid, financial assistance, and political lobbying. International organizations also stepped in to provide relief. This global solidarity was a lifeline for the struggling nation, demonstrating the enduring strength of Armenian identity beyond its geographical borders. It was a clear reminder that the Armenian nation extended far beyond the immediate borders of the new republic. The Nagorno-Karabakh War also profoundly shaped Armenia's foreign policy and its relationships with regional powers. Russia emerged as a key security guarantor for Armenia, maintaining a military base there and providing arms. This alliance, while necessary for security, also limited Armenia's foreign policy options and contributed to its continued isolation from Turkey and Azerbaijan. Negotiations for a lasting peace settlement over Nagorno-Karabakh, mediated by the OSCE Minsk Group, co-chaired by Russia, the United States, and France, continued for decades, but without any significant breakthrough. The status of Nagorno-Karabakh remained unresolved, a frozen conflict poised to reignite. Beyond the war, Armenia embarked on the arduous process of nation-building and democratic transition. It adopted a new constitution, established democratic institutions, and began to implement market reforms. This transition was complex and often painful, marked by political instability, corruption, and the challenges of creating a functioning state from the remnants of the Soviet system. However, compared to some other post-Soviet states, Armenia maintained a relatively stable democratic trajectory, albeit with its share of setbacks. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of the Karabakh War on Armenia's development. While the military victory secured the existence of Artsakh and solidified Armenia's security posture, it also came at the cost of deep isolation and prolonged economic hardship. The conflict remains a central, unresolved issue, a constant reminder of the fragility of peace and the profound historical legacies that continue to shape the region. The early years of independence were defined by this brutal conflict, forging a generation of Armenians who understood the immense price of sovereignty and the ongoing struggle for national survival. Having navigated the treacherous waters of the Nagorno-Karabakh War and the challenging transition to a market economy, modern Armenia, now in the 21st century, faces a new array of complex challenges while simultaneously seeking to solidify its place on the global stage. These challenges aren't just external. They are deeply intertwined with internal reforms, demographic shifts, and the ongoing search for a stable, prosperous future. It's like a ship that has survived a massive storm, but now has to navigate rocky shoals and unpredictable currents in a rapidly changing ocean. At the forefront of Armenia's contemporary challenges remains the unresolved Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Despite the 1994 ceasefire, tensions with Azerbaijan never truly abated. Decades of peace negotiations, mediated by the OSCE Minsk Group, yielded no lasting political settlement. This frozen conflict meant a continuous militarization of the border, frequent skirmishes, and a persistent state of alert, diverting precious resources that could have been used for economic development. The international community, while calling for peace, largely failed to provide the necessary impetus for a breakthrough. This fragile status quo was dramatically shattered by the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in the autumn of 2020. Azerbaijan, heavily armed and supported by Turkey, launched a large-scale military offensive. The 44-day war, fought with modern drones and advanced weaponry, resulted in a decisive Azerbaijani victory. Armenia suffered significant military losses, and Azerbaijan regained control over large territories, including the 7 surrounding districts and parts of Nagorno-Karabakh itself. The ceasefire agreement, brokered by Russia, deployed Russian peacekeepers to a much-reduced Karabakh, but fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape of the South Caucasus. This defeat was a profound national trauma for Armenians, reopening deep wounds and sparking widespread grief and recrimination. It was a stark reminder of their strategic vulnerability and the limits of their alliances. Following the 2020 war, Armenia faced an even more precarious situation. In September 2023, Azerbaijan launched another swift military operation, resulting in the complete reassertion of Azerbaijani control over Nagorno-Karabakh. This led to a mass exodus of virtually the entire ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, over 100,000 people, to Armenia, fearing ethnic cleansing under Azerbaijani rule. This humanitarian crisis placed immense strain on Armenia's resources and societal capacity, adding hundreds of thousands of displaced persons to a country already struggling economically. This event marked the tragic end of a centuries-old Armenian presence in Artsakh, leaving a deep scar on the collective Armenian psyche. Beyond the ongoing regional conflicts, Armenia faces significant internal challenges. Economic development remains a primary concern. The country has struggled to attract sufficient foreign investment, combat corruption, and create a truly diversified economy. Dependence on remittances from the diaspora and a limited industrial base mean that economic growth is often fragile. High unemployment and brain drain, particularly among skilled youth, continue to be pressing issues. Many young Armenians seeking better opportunities emigrate, further exacerbating demographic challenges. It's a constant battle to retain talent and build a robust, self-sustaining economy. Democracy and governance are also ongoing challenges. While Armenia has made strides towards democratic reform, particularly after the Velvet Revolution of 2018, which brought Nikol Pashinyan to power, issues of judicial independence, electoral integrity, and combating entrenched corruption persist. Public trust in institutions has been a recurring concern, especially after the 2020 war and the subsequent loss of Karabakh. Protests and political instability sometimes flare up, reflecting a nation grappling with its political future and seeking accountability. In terms of foreign policy, Armenia is attempting to diversify its alliances while maintaining its crucial, albeit increasingly strained, relationship with Russia. The war in Ukraine and Russia's diminished capacity or willingness to protect Armenia's interests have led to a re-evaluation of its traditional security architecture. Armenia is seeking closer ties with the European Union and the United States, exploring new economic partnerships and security guarantees. However, this shift is delicate, given Russia's historical influence and the ongoing geopolitical complexities of the region, including the continued border disputes and potential threats from Turkey and Azerbaijan. It's like walking a tightrope between powerful, sometimes competing forces. The Armenian diaspora continues to play an indispensable role in the nation's survival and development. Spanning the globe, from the United States and France to Russia and the Middle East, the diaspora provides vital financial aid, invests in various sectors, engages in powerful political lobbying, particularly regarding genocide recognition and aid to Armenia, and fosters cultural and educational ties. While there can sometimes be a disconnect between the diaspora's expectations and the realities on the ground in Armenia, its unwavering support remains a fundamental pillar of national resilience. This global network of Armenians is a unique asset, a testament to the power of shared heritage and collective memory. Historians will undoubtedly analyze the profound impact of the early 21st century's events on Armenia's trajectory. The loss of Artsakh and the subsequent humanitarian crisis have reshaped national identity and forced a painful re-evaluation of geopolitical realities. Yet, through all these trials, the Armenian people continue to demonstrate their enduring spirit, clinging to their ancient language, their unique church, and a profound sense of shared history. The challenges are immense, but the centuries-long narrative of survival against overwhelming odds suggests that the Armenian nation, forged in the crucible of adversity, will continue to strive for a peaceful and prosperous future. Having witnessed the profound shifts and enduring struggles of the early 21st century, Armenia stands at a critical juncture, looking toward a future shaped by the echoes of its past and the persistent challenges of the present. The recent upheavals, particularly the tragic loss of Nagorno-Karabakh and the ensuing humanitarian crisis, have undeniably reshaped the national psyche and forced a sober reckoning with geopolitical realities. Yet, the story of the Armenian people has always been one of remarkable resilience, an ability to adapt, survive, and even thrive in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And this enduring spirit continues to define their path forward. One of the most immediate and profound challenges is the integration of the over 100,000 forcibly displaced Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. This massive influx of refugees, representing a significant percentage of Armenia's existing population, requires immense resources for housing, employment, healthcare, and psychological support. The successful integration of these individuals, preserving their unique cultural nuances while providing them with new opportunities, is not merely a logistical task, but a moral imperative and a crucial component of national cohesion. Imagine adding the population of a medium-sized city to a smaller country almost overnight, and you start to grasp the scale of this humanitarian challenge. It's a test of solidarity and organizational capacity that few nations have faced. Economically, Armenia continues its arduous journey towards sustainable growth, diversifying its economy beyond traditional sectors, fostering innovation in areas like technology, which has seen promising growth, and attracting foreign direct investment remain paramount. Overcoming the energy and transportation blockades imposed by neighboring countries remains a significant hurdle, necessitating the development of alternative routes and energy sources. The government is actively seeking to improve the business climate, combat corruption, and strengthen legal institutions to create a more predictable and attractive environment for investment, both domestic and from the global Armenian diaspora. The success of these reforms will determine Armenia's ability to provide opportunities for its citizens and stem the tide of emigration, which continues to be a drain on human capital. Politically, Armenia is navigating a complex transition, balancing democratic aspirations with the demands of national security in a volatile region. The aftermath of the 2020 war and the 2023 events in Karabakh have led to periods of political instability, public discontent, and calls for accountability. Strengthening democratic institutions, ensuring electoral integrity, and upholding the rule of law are crucial for building public trust and fostering internal cohesion. The relationship between the government and the powerful Armenian Apostolic Church, long intertwined with national identity, also continues to evolve in the context of a modern secular state. In terms of foreign policy, Armenia is actively recalibrating its strategic alliances, while its historical and security ties with Russia remain significant. The perceived limits of Russian protection and the ongoing war in Ukraine have prompted Armenia to seek greater engagement with Western powers, including the European Union and the United States. This involves exploring new security partnerships, deepening economic cooperation, and advocating for its interests on international platforms. However, balancing these new orientations with the realities of its immediate neighborhood, including ongoing border delimitation talks with Azerbaijan and the complex relationship with Turkey, demands astute diplomacy, and strategic foresight. It's a delicate dance on a geopolitical tightrope where every step carries significant weight. Culturally, the Armenian people continue to draw strength from their ancient heritage. The Armenian language, their unique alphabet, the rich traditions of the Armenian Apostolic Church, and a vibrant artistic and intellectual life remain cornerstones of their identity. The global Armenian diaspora, numbering far more than the population within Armenia itself, plays an indispensable role in preserving and promoting this heritage, acting as cultural ambassadors and providing vital support to the homeland. Whether it's through philanthropic projects, cultural exchanges, or political advocacy, the diaspora ensures that the Armenian voice resonates globally. Historians will undoubtedly reflect on how this widespread network of Armenians continues to influence the nation's survival and resurgence in the years to come. The path ahead for Armenia is undoubtedly challenging, fraught with historical grievances, ongoing regional instability, and the complexities of modern nation building. Yet, the unbroken chain of Armenian history, stretching back millennia through empires and cataclysms, is a testament to their extraordinary capacity for survival and renewal. From the ancient kingdoms to the modern republic, from the profound adoption of Christianity to the resilience in the face of genocide, the Armenian people have repeatedly demonstrated their unwavering commitment to their identity and their land. The hopes for a stable, prosperous, and secure future for Armenia rest upon its ability to learn from its past, adapt to its present, and harness the collective strength of its people, both within its borders and across the global diaspora. The story continues, a testament to the enduring spirit of a nation that refuses to fade. As the echoes of these ancient and modern struggles begin to gently fade, and the long winding tapestry of Armenian history softly recedes into the quiet corners of your mind, allow yourself to drift into a state of calm. Imagine the high, rugged peaks of the Armenian highlands, standing silent and steadfast through millennia of sunrises and sunsets, bearing witness to every triumph and every sorrow. Feel the gentle warmth of the Mediterranean sun on the shores of ancient Cilicia, a reminder that even in new lands, dreams can take root and flourish. The soft murmur of ancient prayers, whispered in the unique Armenian tongue, carries through the night air, a timeless melody of faith and perseverance. Remember the resilience, the quiet strength woven into every thread of their story. The grand sweep of empires, the clash of cultures, the indomitable spirit of a people holding fast to their identity, all these images gently soften, blending into a peaceful hush. Let the weight of history settle comfortably, not as a burden, but as a calming presence, a whisper of human endurance and the enduring power of hope. All the trials and triumphs, the moments of despair and the sparks of rebirth now blend into a tranquil, soothing narrative. May your thoughts now turn to gentle repose as the echoes of this journey slowly fade, leaving you with a sense of peace